The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the western hills, and the light that reached the river valley had taken on the deep golden color of late summer evening. You stood at the toll gate on the narrow stone bridge, your right hand resting on the worn wooden beam that barred the way. The beam was smooth in the place where your palm touched it, polished by years of other hands that had pushed it up and pulled it down for travelers and their animals. You could feel the grain of the old oak under your fingers, a familiar pattern of ridges and shallow valleys that you knew without looking. The wood had been cut from a tree long before you were born, and it had darkened to a rich brown that matched the stones of the bridge in the softening light. Below the bridge, the river moved with a steady, unhurried flow. You could hear it passing between the two stone piers that held the arch above the water, a sound that was always there at the edge of your attention. It was not loud, but it was constant, a low murmur made up of many small currents that twisted around the stones and continued downstream. The air that rose from the river was cool and carried the smell of wet stone, mud, and the faint green scent of water plants. When you breathed in, the coolness settled in your chest, and you could feel the day's warmth slowly leaving your shoulders and neck. You had been standing at the gate since noon, and your body had grown accustomed to the weight of your own stillness. The bridge itself was not wide. It was just broad enough for one cart to pass, with low stone parapets on each side that came up to your waist. The stones of the crossing were ancient, set into place centuries ago by hands that had long since turned to dust. They were dark grey and uneven, their surfaces worn smooth in the centre where countless hooves and feet and wheels had travelled over them. At the edges, the stones were rougher, and tufts of pale green moss grew in the cracks. You often looked at those stones during the quiet hours, tracing the lines of mortar with your eyes, noticing the way some stones had settled slightly lower than others, creating a gentle dip in the middle of the crossing. That dip collected water when it rained, but tonight the sky was clear, a pale blue that was deepening toward the east. The toll gate where you stood was on the near side of the bridge, the side that faced the road leading away from the village. A small thatched canopy, no larger than a market stall, gave you shelter from sun and rain. Under it was a wooden stool you rarely used, a clay jug of water, and a leather pouch for the toll coins. But your job tonight was not to collect coins. Your job was to count hooves. The toll was paid in part by a tally of animals crossing, and you were the one who kept the count. You did not write the numbers down. You held them in your mind, repeating them softly to yourself until the next traveller came. It was simple work, and it filled the hours with a quiet, steady purpose. As the sun sank lower, the light changed again. The golden color deepened into amber, and long shadows stretched from the trees on the riverbank. The water below caught the color and held it, so that for a few minutes the river looked like a sheet of hammered bronze moving between the dark piers. You watched the surface without really thinking about it, your eyes following the ripples that spread from a stone near the bank and widened until they disappeared. A bird called from somewhere upstream, a single note that hung in the air and then faded. You shifted your weight from your left foot to your right, and felt the slight ache that came from standing on stone all day. It was a familiar ache, and you had learned to accept it as part of the rhythm of your work. From the direction of the village, you heard a sound that broke the quiet. It was far off at first, a soft, regular thud that reached your ears between the murmur of the river. You lifted your head slightly and listened. The sound was coming along the packed earth road that led to the bridge, and it was growing slowly louder. It was the sound of hooves, and your mind, trained by years of listening, began to separate the rhythm before you could see the animal. There was a heavier thud, followed by a lighter one, then the heavier again, then the lighter. A walking horse. The heavier sound was the front hooves striking the ground, and the lighter sound was the hind hooves following. The rhythm was even and unhurried, the gait of a horse that had worked all day and was being led home in the cool of the evening. You looked up the road and saw them. A farmer was walking beside a cart horse, a large animal with a broad back and feathery hair around its hooves. The farmer held the lead rope loosely in one hand, and his other hand rested on the horse's shoulder. They moved together in the easy way of two creatures who had spent many years side by side. The cart horse's head was low, its ears relaxed, and its great body swayed gently with each step. Behind them, the road was empty, and the fields on either side were turning from gold to grey in the fading light. You straightened your posture without thinking about it and rested both hands on the tall beam. The horse and the farmer drew closer, and the sound of the hooves on the packed earth became clearer. Thud, thud, thud. The beat was slow, perhaps 1 second between each pair of steps, and you let it settle into your mind. You had counted hooves so many times that the process had become as automatic as breathing. You did not need to make an effort. Your attention simply latched onto the sound and followed it, noting each impact as a separate point in a long, quiet line of numbers. When the horse reached the edge of the bridge, the farmer paused and looked at you. He was an older man with a weathered face and a cap pulled low over his forehead. He nodded once, a small gesture of greeting, and you nodded back without speaking. Words were not necessary. You both knew the routine. He clacked his tongue softly, and the horse stepped forward onto the first stone of the crossing. The sound changed instantly. The soft thud of earth became a sharp, ringing clop that echoed briefly between the stone parapets. You heard the first hoof strike, a clean note that rose and faded, and then the second hoof followed, slightly quieter because the horse's weight was still settling. The third hoof made a sound that was almost identical to the first, and the fourth was again a little softer. Then the rhythm repeated as the horse continued its slow walk across the bridge. Clop, clop, clop. Each pair of sounds was separated by a brief silence that was filled by the river's murmur and the creak of the farmer's boots on the stone. You counted them, one by one, letting the numbers form in your mind without speaking them aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then the other 4 as the hind hooves followed the 4. 5, 6, 7, 8. The horse's iron shoes struck the old stone with a clarity that you felt through the soles of your own feet. The bridge was a single arch of solid masonry, and it transmitted vibrations the way a drum transmits sound. You could feel the impact of each hoof as a tiny, distant tremor that traveled up through the stone and into the wooden beam under your hands. It was a sensation so subtle that most people would never notice it, but you had spent so many hours on this bridge that your body had learned to read those tremors the way a sailor reads the movement of the sea. The farmer and the horse reached the middle of the bridge. Here the stones were worn the smoothest, and the sound of the hooves was slightly duller, less sharp, because the surface was not as rough. You noticed the difference, but did not pause your counting. The rhythm continued unchanged, 4 hooves down, 4 hooves lifting, the heavy body of the horse moving with a slow, patient grace. The animal's breath came in deep, steady gusts that you could hear now that they were closer, a soft rushing sound that matched the pace of the walk. The farmer's boots made a scraping noise as he walked, and the leather of the lead rope creaked faintly where it rubbed against the horse's halter. They passed the center of the bridge and began the second half of the crossing. The sound of the hooves grew slightly louder again as the stones became rougher near the far end. You kept your count, 8 distinct clops that you held in your memory like 8 small stones placed in a row. When the horse's hind hoof left the last stone and stepped onto the packed earth of the far bank, the sound changed back to the soft, dull thud you had heard before. The count was complete. You let the number settle in your mind, 1 horse, 8 hoofbeats. Then you let the number go, because the tally for this crossing was done, and you did not need to remember it beyond this moment. The purpose of counting was to observe the passing, not to hold on to it forever. The farmer raised his hand in a brief farewell, and you raised yours in return. You watched them continue along the road on the far side of the river, the horse's shape growing smaller against the darkening fields. The sound of their walking faded slowly, the thud of hooves becoming softer and softer, until it was no longer distinguishable from the background murmur of the evening. A breeze moved along the river, and you felt it touch your face, cool and faintly damp. It carried the scent of cut hay from somewhere up the valley. You were alone on the bridge again. The sun had now slipped below the hills, and the sky was a sheet of pale orange and soft pink that reflected in the river as a wash of color. The water had turned darker, no longer bronze, but a deep slate blue that seemed to thicken as the light left it. The first bats appeared, small dark shapes that fluttered erratically above the surface of the water, catching insects you could not see. You watched them without focusing, your eyes following their unpredictable paths for a moment before returning to the road. The wooden beam under your hands had grown cooler as the evening progressed, and you shifted your grip slightly, moving your palms to a different part of the smooth surface. The toll pouch hung motionless at your side. The clay jug of water sat untouched. All around you, the world was settling into the quiet that comes before true night. The colors were draining from the landscape, leaving behind shapes of gray and deep blue. The trees on the far bank became silhouettes, their individual branches merging into a single dark mass. The hills to the west were a black line against the fading glow of the sky. You listened to the river. It was louder now that the other sounds of the day had gone, or perhaps your hearing had simply adjusted to the quiet. The water moved around the piers with a sound that was both constant and always changing. There was a deeper note where the current pressed against the upstream side of the stone, a low, hollow sound that rose and fell very slightly as the water level shifted. Then there was a lighter, rippling sound where the water separated and flowed past the sides, and a soft gurgle where the two streams joined again on the downstream side. You had heard these sounds so many times that you could identify each one separately, like the voices of different instruments, in a simple song. Together they formed a steady background that filled the silence without disturbing it. The night was coming on slowly, and with it came a deeper stillness. The air grew cooler still, and you drew your wool cloak a little tighter around your shoulders without thinking. The cloak was old and patched in places, but it was thick and kept the dampness of the river from reaching your skin. You could smell the wool, a warm animal scent that mixed with the cool river air. Your feet were planted solidly on the stone, and your weight was balanced evenly. You were not tired in the way of someone who has labored hard. You were tired in the way of someone who has been still for a long time, a gentle, spreading heaviness that made your limbs feel settled and your thoughts slow. You thought about the farmer and the cart horse. You pictured them now at the barn, the harness being unbuckled, the horse led into its stall with fresh straw. The farmer would give it water and a measure of grain, and then he would walk to his house where a light was already burning in the window. These images passed through your mind without any effort, the way clouds pass across the sky. You did not linger on them or attach any feeling to them. They simply drifted through and then were gone, leaving you with the bridge and the river and the darkening sky. Another traveler might come later when the stars were out and the moon had risen, or no one might come for hours. It did not matter. Your task was the same either way. You would stand here at the gate, feeling the worn wood under your hands, hearing the river below, and waiting for the sound of hooves. When they came, you would count them. The counting was a rhythm that pulled you gently along through the night, a simple thread that connected one moment to the next, without any need for urgency or decision. It was a quiet purpose, and it was enough. You looked down at the stones of the bridge near your feet. In the dim light, you could see the shallow depression that ran along the center of the crossing, a smooth channel worn by centuries of hooves passing over the same line. It was deeper here near the gate than it was at the far end, and it shone faintly where the last light of the sky caught the polished surface. You traced the line of it with your eyes, following it out to the middle of the bridge where it disappeared into shadow. It was a mark of time made visible, a record of every animal that had ever crossed this river at this spot. You were a small part of that long story, standing here in the cool evening, adding your own quiet attention to the weight of years. The last color faded from the sky, and the stars began to appear. They came out one by one at first, tiny points of light that seemed to hesitate before growing steady. Then more appeared, and more, until the sky above the river was thick with them. The river itself now reflected the darkness, and you could see the stars mirrored on its surface, trembling slightly as the water moved. The distinction between sky and water became uncertain, and you felt for a moment as though you were suspended between two fields of stars, standing on a narrow strip of stone that was the only solid thing in the world. You breathed in slowly, filling your lungs with the cool, damp air, and then let the breath out just as slowly. The sound of your own breathing was very faint, barely audible above the river. You listened to it for a few cycles, the gentle rise and fall that matched the rhythm of the water and the rhythm of the hoofbeats you had counted earlier. All the rhythms of the night were beginning to align, the slow beat of your heart joining the flow of the river and the memory of hooves on stone. There was a comfort in this alignment, a sense that you were exactly where you were meant to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. The wooden beam creaked softly as you adjusted your hands again. You settled your weight a little more onto your heels and let your shoulders drop. The ache in your lower back was mild and steady, like the sound of the river. You accepted it as part of your posture, part of the long-standing that was your duty. Tomorrow you would stand here again, and the next day, and the day after that. The bridge would be here, and the river, and the slow procession of hooves across the ancient stone. The thought did not bring boredom or weariness. It brought a kind of peace that filled the quiet spaces of your mind. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once and then fell silent. The sound travelled across the fields, thin and distant, and then was swallowed by the river's murmur. You did not turn your head. The night had fully settled now, and the world had shrunk to the span of stone beneath your feet, the cool air on your face, the smooth wood under your hands, and the endless patient sound of water moving through the darkness. You stood and waited, and the bridge waited with you. The darkness had settled fully over the river valley, and the last trace of colour had long since drained from the sky. You stood at the toll gate on the stone bridge, your hands resting on the wooden beam as they had for hours. The night was clear and moonless, and the stars were a dense field of cold white points that stretched from horizon to horizon. Without the moon, the river below was a black ribbon of moving shadow, its surface visible only where the starlight caught the ripples and scattered into a faint, shifting glitter. The air had grown cooler still, and it carried the smell of damp stone and the faint, clean scent of water that had travelled down from the hills. You could feel the chill through the soles of your boots, a slow cold that rose from the ancient stones and settled into the bones of your feet. The world had grown very quiet. The village behind you was asleep, its windows dark, its fires banked for the night. The fields on either side of the river were empty and silent, the crops standing motionless under the stars. Even the river seemed to speak more softly now, its murmur reduced to a low, continuous hush that was barely louder than your own breathing. The bats had gone to their roosts, and the night birds were silent. There was only the water, the stone, the stars, and the slow, patient rhythm of your own heart. In such deep quiet, sound travelled far. Your ears, accustomed to the stillness, had grown sharp. You could hear the tiny lap of water against the stone pier just below where you stood, a delicate sound like a cat drinking. You could hear the creak of the wooden beam when you shifted your weight. You could hear the soft rustle of your own clothing as your cloak moved against your shoulders. And because the world was so still, you heard the sound the moment it began. It came from the far side of the river, from the road that led away into the dark countryside. At first it was so faint that you were not certain you had heard it at all, a mere suggestion of a rhythm at the very edge of perception. You lifted your head slightly, turning your ear toward the darkness beyond the bridge. Your hands remained still on the beam, and your breathing slowed as you concentrated. There it was again, a soft, regular thud, thud, coming from somewhere out in the night. A horse walking. The sound was still a long way off, but it was unmistakable. Your mind, trained by countless hours of listening, had already locked on to the pattern. You waited without moving. There was no need to do anything else. The toll gate was ready, the beam was down, and the night was empty of all other distractions. You simply stood and listened, letting the distant hoofbeats fill your attention the way the river's murmur had filled it moments before. The rhythm was slow and even, the gait of a horse that was being ridden, not driven. You could tell by the spacing. A rider's horse walks differently from a cart horse, with a slightly longer pause between the fore and hind steps because the weight of the rider shifts the balance. You had counted enough hooves in your life to know these things without thinking about them. The knowledge was in your ears and in your body, not in your mind. As the minutes passed, the sound grew slowly louder. The thud of hooves on packed earth was a dull, percussive beat that seemed to push the silence aside in gentle waves. Each impact was a soft concussion that traveled through the ground and reached you through the soles of your boots as much as through the air. The vibrations were so faint that they were more like a memory of motion than an actual sensation, a subtle tremor that came and went with every step. You let the rhythm wash over you, counting the beats without numbers, simply feeling the pattern as it repeated and repeated. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, the endless cycle of a walking horse. Then you saw the light. It appeared as a tiny point of warm yellow in the far distance, too small to be a house window and too low to be a star. It swayed gently from side to side as it moved, and you knew it was a lantern hung from the saddle of the approaching rider. The light was faint but steady, and as you watched it grew slowly larger, resolving into a small globe of flame that pushed back the darkness in a narrow circle. The horse and rider themselves were still invisible, hidden somewhere behind the lantern's glow, but the light told you everything you needed to know about their approach. It bobbed with the rhythm of the horse's walk, a visual counterpoint to the sound of the hooves. You watched the lantern as it drew closer. Its sway was hypnotic, a slow, regular pendulum that moved from left to right and back again in time with the animal's stride. The light it cast was soft and orange, the color of candle flame, and it reflected faintly on the surface of the road in a shifting pool of brightness. Around the lantern, the darkness seemed deeper by contrast, a black void that pressed in from all sides. But you kept your eyes on the light, and as it grew nearer, you began to make out the shape of the horse behind it. The animal was dark, perhaps a bay or a black, and it moved with a relaxed, easy gait. On its back sat a rider wrapped in a traveling cloak, the hood pulled up against the night chill. One hand held the reins loosely, and the other rested on the pommel of the saddle. The lantern swung from a short hook near the rider's knee, casting long shadows that danced across the road. The sound of the hooves on earth was now clearly audible, a steady thud, thud, thud that matched the sway of the lantern. You could hear the slight variation in each beat. The front hooves struck with a heavier, deeper sound, while the hind hooves were lighter and quicker. There was a tiny pause between the second and third beat of each set, the moment when the horse's weight shifted from the diagonal pair of legs to the other pair. You listened to that pause, letting it mark the boundary between one half of the stride and the next. The rhythm was like a slow breath, in and out, and you found that your own breathing had fallen into the same pattern without your noticing. The rider and horse reached the far edge of the bridge. You saw the horse's head enter the circle of starlight first, a long, elegant shape with pricked ears and a dark muzzle. The rider's face was still hidden in the shadow of the hood, but you could see the glint of the lantern's flame in the horse's eye, a tiny orange spark that appeared and disappeared as the animal blinked. They paused for a moment at the edge of the stone, and you heard the rider's voice, soft and low, speaking a quiet word to the horse. Then the horse lifted its forehoof and placed it on the first stone of the crossing. The change in sound was immediate and profound. The soft, earthy thud gave way to a sharp, ringing clop that cut through the night air with a clarity that was almost startling. The stone amplified the impact, sending the sound bouncing between the low parapets and out over the river. You heard the first hoof strike, a clean, percussive note that rose and then faded into the darkness downstream. An instant later, the second hoof followed, producing a sound that was almost identical, and then the third, and then the third, and then the fourth. Clop, 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 clop. The rhythm had transformed from a dull, earthy beat into a bright, ringing cadence that seemed to hang in the air after each step. You began your count, not with words but with a silent awareness that marked each impact as it occurred. The horse walked slowly, and each hoof fell with a deliberate, measured pace. You could feel the vibrations through the bridge now, much stronger than the faint tremors you had sensed from the earth. The stone was a solid, continuous medium, and it transmitted the shock of each hoof strike directly to the wooden beam under your hands. The beam hummed faintly with every impact, a tiny shiver that traveled up through your palms and into your wrists. You could gauge the horse's weight by the depth of that vibration. It was a riding horse, not a heavy draft animal, but it was substantial enough to make the old stones sing. The sound was deep and resonant, not the light, quick clatter of a pony or a mule. As the horse advanced onto the bridge, the sound grew louder. The animal was now fully on the stone, its iron shoes striking the ancient surface with a steady, rhythmic precision. The echo of each hoofbeat spread out from the bridge in all directions, bouncing off the water and the stone walls and the dark trees on the banks. A moment after each impact, you could hear the echo return, fainter and softer, as if the river itself were counting along with you. The original clop would ring out sharply, and then, a heartbeat later, a ghost of the sound would come drifting back from downstream, a soft, blurred repetition that dissolved into the murmur of the water. You listened to the echoes carefully, noting how they changed as the horse moved across the bridge. When the animal was near the near end, the echo was short and quick because the sound had only a small distance to travel before it hit the bank and returned. As the horse moved toward the center, the echo grew longer, the sound traveling out over the open river and reflecting back from the far shore. At the midpoint, the echo was at its longest, a clear, delayed copy of the original hoofbeat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, as the horse moved toward the far end, the echo shortened again, contracting until it was nearly simultaneous with the original sound. You let your attention follow these changes without effort, the way your eyes might follow the ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The rider was close enough now that you could hear the creak of the saddle leather and the soft jingle of the bit rings. The horse's breath came in steady, rhythmic gusts, a deep huff, huff, huff that matched the pace of the walk. You could see the animal's muscles moving under its dark coat, the flex and release of the shoulders and haunches with each step. The lantern light played over the horse's flanks, highlighting the sheen of sweat from a long journey, and it cast the rider's shadow onto the stone parapet, a tall, distorted shape that moved silently alongside them. They reached the center of the bridge. Here the stones were worn smooth by centuries of passage, and the sound of the hooves changed slightly. The sharp, ringing clop became a little softer, a little rounder, as the rough texture that produced the bright sound had been polished away. The hoof beats still echoed, but the initial impact was less crisp, more of a muffled thock than a clear clop. You noticed this difference, filed it away in the quiet corner of your mind, where such observations lived, and continued your silent count. The horse's hind hooves struck the stone with a slightly different character than the forehooves. The forehooves landed with a forward-reaching motion that produced a sound more centered under the shoulder, while the hind hooves landed more directly under the body, creating a sharper, more vertical impact. You could hear this distinction in the bridge's song, a subtle variation that repeated with every stride. The pattern was intricate and beautiful in its simplicity. 4 deep, hind sharp, 4 deep, hind sharp, over and over, like a language spoken by the stone itself. You stood motionless at the toll gate, your hands resting lightly on the wooden beam. The rider did not look at you. Their head remained bowed under the hood, and their attention seemed fixed on the road ahead. Perhaps they were tired, thinking of a warm fire and a bed at the next inn, wherever that might be. Perhaps they were simply lost in the rhythm of the ride, the way you were lost in the rhythm of the Count. You did not need to stop them or speak to them. The toll for a single rider with no cart and no trade goods was so small that it was often waived, and tonight there was no coin to collect, only hooves to count. So you let them pass, adding their animals 8 beats to the silent tally that was your only duty. The horse's 4 hooves reached the far end of the bridge. The first hoof left the stone and stepped onto the packed earth of the far bank. The sharp ringing sound disappeared instantly, replaced by the dull, soft thud you had heard before. The horse took another step, and now only the hind hooves were still on the stone. The sound of the bridge was half silenced, a rhythm cut in 2. Another step, and the last hoof left the stone. The final clop rang out once, echoed softly downstream, and then faded into the night. The count was complete. 8 hoof beats, measured and recorded in the quiet chamber of your attention. You did not hold on to the number, you simply acknowledged it and then released it, letting it drift away like a leaf on the river. The purpose of the count was finished, and there was no need to remember it any longer. Your mind became still again, open and waiting for the next sound. You watched the rider and horse continue along the road. The lantern light grew smaller and smaller, its gentle sway still visible long after the sound of the hooves had faded. The circle of yellow light shrank to a point, then to a tiny spark, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the distance. The rider had passed, and the night was once again empty of all human presence except your own. The silence that returned was deeper than before. It was as though the sound of the hoof-beats had cleared a space in the air, and now that space was filling slowly with the quiet that had always been there. The river's murmur came back into your awareness, softer now, a gentle, continuous flow of sound that had never actually stopped. The stars seemed brighter, the air colder, the stone under your feet more solid. You breathed in slowly, and the cool, damp air filled your lungs with the taste of the river. You shifted your weight slightly, easing the pressure on your left hip, and listened to the tiny sounds of your own movement. The wooden beam creaked, your boot scraped against the stone, the fabric of your cloak brushed against itself. These sounds were small and intimate, and they seemed loud in the aftermath of the hoofbeats. But they quickly faded, and you settled back into stillness, your hands finding their familiar place on the worn surface of the beam. The echo of the horse's passage still lingered in your memory. You could replay the sound in your mind if you chose to, the changing timbre from earth to stone, the deep resonance of the iron shoes, the ghostly echoes trailing off downstream. But you did not replay it. You simply let it sit there, a quiet impression that would fade in its own time. The night was long, and other travelers would come before dawn, or they might not. Either way, you would be here, standing at the gate, listening to the river and the stars and the slow turning of the earth. The chill of the stone crept up through your boots, and you flexed your toes inside the leather to keep the blood moving. The movement was automatic, something your body did without consulting your mind. Your thoughts had grown slow and diffuse, like mist spreading over a meadow. There was no urgency in them, no direction. They simply drifted, touching on the memory of the lantern light, the feel of the bridge's vibration, the patient rhythm of the horse's breath, and then moving on to nothing at all. You were not lonely. The bridge was company enough, and the river, and the stars. The night wrapped around you like a familiar blanket, and you felt yourself merging with the stillness, becoming part of the stone and the water and the cold air. Your breathing was slow and deep, your heartbeat steady, your posture relaxed but alert. You were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to do, and that knowledge was a quiet comfort that needed no words. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a single low note that hung in the air and then dissolved. You heard it without turning your head, acknowledging it as you might acknowledge a nod from a passing acquaintance. The sound came and went, and the silence returned, deeper than before. You waited, and the night waited with you, and the ancient stones of the bridge held you up in the darkness while the river flowed endlessly beneath your feet. The deep quiet that comes before midnight had settled over the bridge and the river valley, a stillness so complete that it seemed to have its own weight and presence. You stood at the toll gate, your hands resting on the worn wooden beam, your body motionless in the way that a heron stands motionless at the water's edge. The stars had wheeled partway across the sky since the last traveller passed, and the constellations that had been low on the horizon were now high overhead, their cold light falling on the stone parapets and the dark water below. The air was chill and still, carrying the scent of wet stone and the faint, clean smell of the river. Your breath emerged in small, quiet puffs that vanished almost instantly, and the cold had begun to settle into the joints of your fingers where they curled around the beam. The river murmured its endless, patient song, a sound that had become so familiar that you no longer heard it as separate from the silence. It was simply there, a low, constant hush that flowed beneath all other sounds, the way water flows beneath ice. Occasionally a small splash would rise from the darkness below, a fish breaking the surface or a stone shifting in the current, and the sound would hang in the air for a moment before dissolving back into the murmur. The night was deep, and the world was asleep, and you were the only waking soul for miles in any direction. Then, from the road that led to the village, you heard a new sound beginning. It was so faint at first that it might have been a trick of the tired mind, a rhythm imagined rather than heard, but your ears had grown sharp in the long hours of darkness, and you caught the tiny, regular pattern and held it. This was not the deep, slow thud of a horse. It was lighter, quicker, a delicate tap-tap that came faster than a horse's walk, and with a different cadence entirely. A mule, you thought, or perhaps a small donkey, the kind of animal that a travelling scribe or a peddler might ride. The sound was still far off, but it was growing steadily louder, and you turned your head just slightly to face the dark road. The night was moonless, but the starlight was bright enough to show the pale ribbon of the road as it wound away between the dark masses of the fields. You could see nothing moving yet, but you could hear the hooves clearly now, a quick, light rhythm that had a slightly uneven quality. Mules did not walk with the smooth, flowing gait of a well-trained riding horse. They placed their feet with a kind of careful deliberation, as though testing each spot of ground before trusting it with their weight. The sound reflected this caution, tap-pause, 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 a pattern that was almost but not quite regular, full of tiny hesitations and adjustments. Your mind, trained to separate and count any hoofbeat, adjusted itself to this new rhythm, finding the order within the apparent irregularity. As the sound drew closer, you began to make out a faint glow on the road. It was not the bright swaying lantern of the previous rider, but something smaller and steadier, a soft, diffused light that seemed to float just above the ground. A candle lantern perhaps, or a small oil lamp hung from the mule's harness. The light was weak, barely enough to illuminate the road immediately ahead, and it cast no long shadows. It simply glowed, a warm, honey-colored point in the vast darkness, and it bobbed very slightly with the mule's careful steps. The scribe came into view slowly, emerging from the darkness by degrees. First you saw the mule, a small, neat animal with a grey coat and long ears that swiveled constantly, tracking sounds you could not hear. Its head was low, its muzzle close to the ground, and it walked with that characteristic caution, each small hoof touching the packed earth with a soft, precise tap. On its back sat a figure wrapped in a heavy travelling cloak, the hood thrown back despite the cold, revealing a pale, thin face with deep-set eyes. The scribe was an older man, his hair grey and his shoulders slightly stooped, and he held the reins loosely in one hand while the other rested on a leather satchel that hung across his body. The satchel was bulging with the shapes of books or scrolls, and a small writing case was strapped to the mule's saddle behind him. You watched them approach without moving. The mule's hooves continued their quick, light rhythm on the earth, a sound that was more like a soft drumming than the deep percussion of a horse. Each hoof struck the ground with a neat, contained impact, the sound lasting only a fraction of a second before the next one fell. The pace was faster than a horse's walk, perhaps 3 beats for every 2 of a larger animal, and the lighter weight of the mule meant that there was almost no vibration traveling through the ground. You could not feel the footsteps through your boots, the way you could feel a horse. You could only hear them, a delicate, rapid patter that grew louder as the pair approached the bridge. The scribe did not appear to notice you at first. His gaze was fixed somewhere in the middle distance, and his lips moved slightly, as though he were reciting something to himself or composing a letter in his mind. His expression was abstracted, the look of a man whose thoughts were far from the dark road in the cold night. The mule, however, had noticed you. Its long ears swiveled forward, and it slowed its pace slightly, hesitating as it reached the edge of the bridge. The scribe, roused by the change in movement, looked up and saw you standing at the toll gate. He blinked once, slowly, and then gave a small, absent nod, the gesture of someone acknowledging a fact rather than a person. You nodded back, a simple, wordless greeting that required no further exchange. The scribe clucked his tongue softly, and the mule, after a brief hesitation, placed its first small hoof onto the stone of the crossing. The sound that followed was entirely different from anything you had heard earlier in the night, where the cart horse's hoof had rung out with a deep, resonant clop that seemed to shake the bridge, and the riding horse's hoof had produced a bright, clean note that echoed downstream. The mule's hoof made a light, sharp clack. It was a smaller, tighter sound, more like a stone tapping against another stone than like an iron shoe striking rock. The impact was quick and precise, and the echo that followed was short and thin, a faint click that faded almost immediately into the river's murmur. The mule took another step, and another, and each small hoof produced that same delicate sound, clack, clack, plack, a rapid succession of bright staccato notes that seemed to dance across the surface of the bridge. You began your count immediately, your mind settling into the rhythm with the ease of long practice. The mule's gait was a 4-beat walk, the same as any horse, but the beats came faster and with less weight behind them. The fore-hoof struck first, a neat, sharp sound that you marked as 1. The opposite hind hoof followed almost immediately, a lighter note that you marked as 2, then the other fore-hoof 3, and the remaining hind hoof 4. The pattern repeated without pause, and you found yourself counting more quickly than you had for the horses, your silent tally keeping pace with the mule's brisk, careful steps. Clack 1, clack 2, clack 3, clack 4, over and over, a gentle, rapid litany that filled the space behind your eyes. The mule walked with an unusual deliberation that affected the rhythm. Unlike a horse, which moves with a steady, flowing stride, this animal tested each stone before committing its full weight. You could hear the tiny variations in the sound. Sometimes a hoof would strike, and then there would be a fractional pause before the next one fell, as though the mule had reconsidered its footing. At other times, 2 hooves would land almost simultaneously, producing a doubled clack that you had to separate in your mind to keep the count accurate. The scribe, seemingly unaware of his mount's caution, swayed gently in the saddle, his abstracted gaze still fixed on nothing, his lips still moving silently. The small lantern swung from a hook on the saddle, its light dancing across the stone parapet in a slow, irregular pattern. You let the count occupy your whole attention. The numbers formed themselves without effort, a quiet sequence that flowed through your mind like the river flowed under the bridge. There was a satisfaction in the precision of it, in the way each hoofbeat was caught and noted and then released to make room for the next. You were not thinking about anything else. The world had contracted to the span of the bridge, and the sound of 8 small hooves picking their way across the ancient stone. The night, the cold, the stars, all of it had faded into the background, and there was only the counting. The mule reached the center of the bridge. Here the stones were worn almost smooth, and the sound of the hooves changed very slightly. The sharp clack became a little softer, a little more muffled, as the rough texture that produced the bright sound was absent. The note was still light and quick, but it had a rounder quality, more of a tock than a clack. You noted the change without breaking the count, adjusting your perception to the new sound as a musician adjusts to a changing key. The mule's hooves continued their careful progress, and the numbers continued their silent march through your mind. You could see the animal clearly now, illuminated by its small lantern. It was a neat, well-cared-for creature, its grey coat brushed smooth, its mane and tail trimmed. The muscles in its thin legs worked steadily as it walked, and its long ears continued their constant, independent movement, one swivelling back toward the scribe, the other pointing forward into the darkness beyond the bridge. Its breath emerged in small white puffs that were much smaller than a horse's, and the smell of the animal reached you, a warm, dusty scent of hide and straw, with a faint hint of the oil used to condition its hooves. The scribe himself had the look of a man who spent more time with books than with people, his cloak of good quality, but carelessly fastened, his hands ink-stained even in the dim light, his boots scuffed but sturdy. They passed the midpoint, and the sound of the hooves began to grow slightly sharper again, as the mule walked onto the rougher stones at the far end of the bridge. The clack returned, crisp and bright, and the echoes, though still small, became a little more distinct. The mule's pace did not change. It maintained its careful, deliberate walk, placing each hoof with the same precision it had shown from the first step onto the stone. You continue to count, your mind a quiet, steady metronome, marking each beat as it came and then letting it go. The count was now in its second half, and you could feel the approach of its completion, the quiet satisfaction of a task nearly finished. The scribe shifted in the saddle, adjusting his grip on the reins, and the mule responded by lifting its head slightly and quickening its pace for a single step before settling back into its careful rhythm. The momentary change caused a brief flutter in the count, two hooves landing almost together, and you had to pause internally and separate them, finding the true sequence before continuing. It was a tiny challenge, a small exercise for a mind that had little else to do, and it passed as quickly as it had come. The rhythm steadied, and the counting resumed its smooth, unhurried flow. The mule's four hooves reached the far end of the bridge. You heard the first hoof leave the stone and strike the packed earth, the sound changing from a sharp clack to a soft, dull tap. The transition was as clean as a knife cut, the bright bridge sound ending and the muted earth sound beginning, with no blending or overlap. Another hoof left the stone, then another, and then only the hind hoofs were still on the bridge. The final clack rang out once, a tiny, bright note that seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat before it faded. Then the mule was fully on the earth, and the sound of its walking became once again that soft, rapid tap-tap that you had first heard approaching. The count was complete. The scribe's mule had crossed the bridge, and its 8 small hoofbeats had been noted and recorded in the silent ledger of your attention. You did not need to hold on to the number. You simply acknowledged that it was done, and then you let it go, the way you might release a breath you had been holding without realizing. Your mind became still and empty again, ready for the next sound, the next traveler, the next count. The scribe and his mule continued along the road into the village. You watched the small bobbing light of the lantern as it moved away, growing smaller and smaller, its gentle sway a visual echo of the hoofbeats you had just counted. The scribe did not look back. His head remained slightly bowed, his lips still moving, his thoughts still occupied with whatever words or numbers or ideas filled his quiet, scholarly world. The light receded until it was no more than a tiny point of warmth in the vast darkness, and then it rounded a bend or crested a rise, and it was gone. The silence that followed was as deep as any you had experienced that night. The little mule's quick, light hoofbeats had filled the air with a delicate, rapid pattern, and now that pattern was absent, the quiet seemed to press in from all sides. You listened to the river, which had never stopped its murmur, and let the sound wash over you. The cold was a little sharper now, or perhaps you had simply become more aware of it, and you pulled your cloak a little tighter with a slow automatic movement. The wooden beam under your hands was cold and smooth, and you could feel every tiny ridge and grain in the old oak. You thought about the scribe for a moment, picturing him arriving at a small room somewhere in the village, lighting a candle, opening his satchel, and spreading his scrolls across a wooden table. He would dip his quill in ink and begin to write, the nib scratching across the parchment in the same careful, deliberate rhythm that his mule had used to cross the bridge. The thought passed through your mind without leaving any trace, a cloud moving across the sky of your attention. You did not cling to it or elaborate on it. You simply observed it and let it go. Your body settled back into its familiar posture, weight balanced, hands resting on the beam, eyes gazing out into the darkness. The ache in your feet and lower back was a steady, companionable presence, a reminder of the hours you had spent standing on the stone. You were not uncomfortable. You were simply aware of your body in the way that stillness makes you aware, each small sensation becoming clear and distinct. The river murmured, the stars shone, and the night continued its slow, silent journey toward dawn. Somewhere in the distance a fox barked, a sharp, high sound that cut through the quiet and then was gone. You heard it without reacting, your ears automatically cataloguing it as a night sound, nothing that required your attention. The echo of the bark faded, and the river's hush filled the space it left behind. You were alone again. Alone with the bridge and the stone and the flowing water, waiting patiently for the next set of hooves to approach out of the darkness. The hours before dawn were the longest, but you did not count them. You measured time not in hours or minutes, but in hoofbeats and silences, in the slow procession of animals across the ancient crossing. Each set of 4 legs that passed was a small marker, a point in the long, quiet line of the night, and you moved from one to the next with the same calm, unthinking rhythm that the river used to move from one bend to the next. There was no hurry, no impatience, no desire for anything other than what was already here. The bridge was here, the night was here, and you were here, and that was all that mattered. The night had grown very old, and the stars that had been high overhead were now sinking toward the western horizon. You stood at the toll gate, your body settled into the familiar stillness that had become as comfortable as sleep. The wooden beam was cool and damp under your hands, and the air had changed in a way that was almost too subtle to name. It was not colder exactly, but it carried a new softness, a faint moisture that clung to your skin and made the stone beneath your feet feel slick. The river's murmur seemed closer, the sounds of the water more distinct, as though the air itself had thickened and was carrying sound more readily. You had lived long enough by the river to know what this meant. Rain was coming. It began not with a sudden downpour, but with a single drop that landed on the thatch of the canopy above your head. The sound was tiny, a soft tap that was almost lost in the river's constant hush. Then another drop fell, and another, each one a distinct, delicate impact on the dried reeds. The rhythm was slow at first, one drop every few seconds, and you could hear each one separately, a gentle, irregular percussion that seemed to be testing the silence. The drops fell on the stone parapets too, making small dark circles that spread and vanished as the porous rock absorbed the moisture. The smell of wet stone rose around you, clean and cold and ancient, the scent of the bridge itself awakening under the rain. Within a few minutes the rhythm grew more steady. The single drops became a soft, continuous patter, a hushed, shushing sound as the rain fell on the thatch and the stones and the dark surface of the river. The river itself received the rain in silence. The drops merged with the flowing water without a splash, disappearing into the current as though they had always been part of it. But on the bridge, the sound was everywhere, a gentle, percussive whisper that filled the space between the parapets and wrapped around you like a blanket. You could hear the rain on the wooden beam under your hands, a softer, duller tapping than the sharper sound on stone. The beam's surface grew slick, and you adjusted your grip slightly, spreading your fingers to find the drier grain beneath. The rain was not heavy, it was a steady, gentle fall. the kind of rain that could last for hours without becoming a storm. The drops were small and fine, almost a mist at times, and they drifted through the air in slow diagonal lines when the breeze stirred. Under the canopy you were mostly sheltered, though occasional gusts sent a fine spray against your face. The coolness of the water was refreshing rather than uncomfortable, and you found yourself breathing more deeply, the damp air filling your lungs with the taste of the river and the sky. Your cloak grew heavy with absorbed moisture, and the world began to smell of wet sheep, a warm animal scent that mingled with the mineral smell of the stone. The rain changed the soundscape of the bridge in ways you had learned to recognize over many nights. The river, which had been a low murmur, now seemed to speak with a more complex voice. The drops hitting the surface created a million tiny rings that spread and intersected and disappeared, and the sound of their impact was a high, soft hiss that overlaid the deeper flow of the current. Under the arch of the bridge, the sound was different again. The rain falling into the water there made a hollow echoing plink, each drop amplified by the stone vault above it. The echo of that sound travelled back to you, a faint, ghostly music that seemed to come from somewhere inside the bridge itself. You listened to all of it without focusing on any single part, letting the layered sounds blend into a single, peaceful presence. Time moved differently in the rain. The darkness, which had been sharp and clear under the stars, was now soft and blurred, the edges of things dissolving into a grey, misty obscurity. You could no longer see the far bank clearly. It was a vague dark shape behind a curtain of falling water. The road behind you had become a strip of mud that gleamed faintly in the starlight that still filtered through the clouds. The world had shrunk to the bridge and the rain and the sound of the river, and you were at the center of it, dry under your canopy, watching the water bead on the wooden beam and drip from the edge of the thatch in a slow, regular rhythm. You did not know how long the rain had been falling when you heard the new sound. At first it was barely distinguishable from the hiss of the rain on the ground, a low rhythmic rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. But your ears, attuned to the sounds of the road, picked out the pattern and separated it from the rain. It was the sound of wheels, heavy wooden wheels turning slowly on wet earth, and beneath that sound was the deeper, slower tread of large animals. You lifted your head slightly, peering into the rain, and waited. They emerged from the darkness like a ship emerging from fog. Two great oxen, their broad heads low and their horns curving outward, pulled a covered wagon that creaked and rumbled over the muddy road. The animals were massive, their shoulders as high as a man's chest, their hides a deep, dull brown that was now slick with rain. They moved with a ponderous, unhurried gait, their huge bodies swaying from side to side with each step. Behind them, the wagon was a dark shape under a canvas cover, its wooden wheels turning slowly, the iron rims squelching in the mud. On the driver's seat sat a drover wrapped in a heavy, oiled cloak, the hood pulled low, his face invisible. He held a long switch in one hand, but he did not use it. It rested across his knees, and he guided the oxen with low, murmured words that you could not quite hear. The sound of their approach grew steadily, filling the night with a deep, slow rhythm. The oxen's feet were broad and cloven, not hooved like a horse's, and they struck the ground with a soft, sucking thud rather than a sharp clop. The sound was heavier than a horse's, deeper and more diffuse, and it seemed to come from the whole surface of the foot, rather than from a single point. There was a wet, squelching quality to it, the sound of mud releasing its grip on the cloven toes, and each step was followed by a small pause as the animal shifted its great weight before taking the next. The rhythm was much slower than a horse's walk, perhaps half the pace, and it had a rolling oceanic quality that matched the sway of the animals' bodies. The wagon wheels added their own voice to the rhythm. The wooden rims, bound with iron, turned with a low continuous rumble that varied as they passed over stones or through deeper mud. The axle creaked with a high, thin sound that was almost musical, a repeated note that sang out every few seconds. The canvas cover flapped softly in the rain, and the wooden frame of the wagon groaned as it flexed. All these sounds blended together into a slow, heavy symphony that rolled toward the bridge like a wave approaching the shore. The drover guided the oxen to the edge of the bridge and then paused. You saw him lean forward slightly, peering through the rain at the toll gate where you stood. You raised a hand in a simple gesture, acknowledging his presence, and he nodded once, a quick, economical motion. No words were exchanged, none were needed. He spoke softly to the oxen, a low, soothing sound that you felt rather than heard, and the team stepped forward onto the first stone of the crossing. The change in sound was immediate. The soft, wet thud of mud gave way to a firmer, more solid sound as the broad cloven feet struck the stone. It was not a clop or a clack, it was a deep, muffled thump, like a heavy bag of grain dropped onto a floor. The rain that covered the stones softened the impact further, adding a wet, slippery quality to the sound. A faint squelch as the cloven toes spread on the slick surface. Each footfall was distinct, but the edges of the sound were blurred, the way a reflection is blurred in water. The echo that followed was short and deep, a low, rumbling after-sound that seemed to roll down the river and disappear. You began your count, settling into the slower rhythm with the same calm attention you had given to the horse and the mule. The first ox stepped forward, its right forefoot landing with a deep thump that you marked as 1. Its left hind foot followed, a softer, slightly wetter sound that you marked as 2. Then the left forefoot 3, and the right hind foot 4. The first ox had passed a full stride, and now the second ox began its turn. Its right forefoot struck the stone, 5, and the left hind foot followed, 6. The left forefoot 7, and finally the right hind foot 8. The 8 beats of the 2 oxen formed a slow rolling sequence that took much longer to complete than a horse's 8 beats, and you let the count stretch out, feeling the weight of each number as it settled into your mind. The oxen continued their slow, patient walk across the bridge. Their huge bodies filled the narrow space between the parapets, and you could feel the bridge tremble under their combined weight. The vibration was deeper and stronger than anything a horse could produce, a slow rhythmic sway that traveled up through the stone and into the wooden beam under your hands. The beam itself seemed to hum at a low frequency, a barely perceptible oscillation that matched the pace of the oxen's steps. You adjusted your stance slightly, spreading your feet a little wider to absorb the movement and continue the count without interruption. The sound of the wagon wheels on the stone was different from the sound on earth. On mud they had rumbled and squelched. On stone they clattered and rattled, a harsh, irregular noise that contrasted with the soft thud of the hooves. The iron rims struck the uneven stones with a series of sharp, metallic bangs, and the wooden spokes creaked and groaned as the weight of the wagon shifted. The canvas cover flapped with each jolt, and the cargo inside, perhaps sacks of grain or barrels of flour, shifted with a low sliding sound. The drover sat motionless on his seat, his body swaying with the movement of the wagon, his voice a quiet, continuous murmur that soothed the oxen and kept them steady. You listened to the whole complex of sounds, separating them in your mind the way you might separate the different threads of a tapestry. The oxen's feet, the wheels, the creaking axle, the flapping canvas, the drover's voice, the rain on the stones, the river beneath, each had its own rhythm and its own tone, and together they formed a complete soundscape that was unique to this moment. But your counting remained focused on the hooves, the 8 deep thumps that marked the passage of the 2 animals across the ancient crossing. The oxen reached the center of the bridge. Here the stones were slick with rain, and the cloven hooves made a slightly different sound, a wetter, more sucking noise as they lifted from the smooth surface. The animals did not hurry. They walked with the same slow, deliberate pace they had maintained from the start, their heads low, their breath emerging in great billowing clouds of steam that the rain quickly dispersed. You could smell them now, a warm, rich odor of hide and sweat and the clean scent of rain-soaked animals. It was a comforting smell, earthy and alive, and it mixed with the mineral tang of the wet stone and the fresh, cold scent of the rain. The drover lifted his head slightly as they passed the midpoint, and you caught a glimpse of his face under the hood. It was a weathered face, lined and brown, with a short grey beard and eyes that were calm and patient. He did not look at you directly. His attention was on the oxen and the road ahead, but there was a quiet competence in the way he held himself, the ease of a man who had done this work 1,000 times before. His switch remained across his knees, unused, and he guided the team with nothing but the gentle pressure of the reins and the low rhythmic sound of his voice. The words themselves were indistinguishable, just a murmur, but the tone was steady and reassuring, a kind of spoken lullaby for the great beasts. The count continued, the numbers flowing through your mind with the slow, heavy rhythm of the oxen. You were in no hurry. The animals were in no hurry. The animals were in no hurry. The pace was so slow that each beat seemed to hang in the air for a moment before the next one arrived, and the space between the beats was filled by the clatter of the wheels and the hiss of the rain and the distant murmur of the river. It was a rhythm that encouraged stillness, a rhythm that said there was no need to rush, that everything would happen in its own time. You let your breathing slow to match it, your heart beating in time with the deep, rolling cadence of the cloven hooves on the wet stone. The wagon reached the 3/4 mark of the bridge. The sound of the wheels began to change as they rolled onto the slightly rougher stones near the far end, the clatter becoming sharper, more irregular. One of the oxen slipped very slightly, its hoof skidding a fraction on the slick surface, and you heard the tiny wet squeak of horn against stone. The animal recovered instantly, its great muscles bunching under the hide, and the rhythm resumed without a break. The drover murmured something low and soothing, and the oxen continued as though nothing had happened. You noted the slip without alarm. It was a small thing, a minor adjustment in the long, slow journey across the river. The 4 feet of the led ox reached the far end of the bridge. You heard the familiar transition as the first foot left the stone and struck the rain-soaked earth, the sound changing from a firm, muffled thump to a soft, wet squelch. The second foot followed, then the third and the fourth, and then the second ox began to make the same transition. The cloven hooves left the stone one by one, each final thump marking the end of that animal's passage across the bridge. The count was approaching its end, the last few numbers settling into place with the same quiet certainty as the first. When the final hind hoof of the second ox lifted from the stone and sank into the mud of the far bank, the count was complete. 2 oxen, 8 hooves, 1 wagon. You let the numbers go. The wagon continued along the road on the far side, its shape growing indistinct behind the curtain of rain. You could still hear the rumble of the wheels and the soft, sucking thud of the oxen's feet for a long time after they had left the bridge, the sounds fading slowly into the hiss of the rain. The drover did not look back, and the oxen did not pause. They continued their patient, plodding journey to wherever they were bound, and soon they were gone entirely, swallowed by the rain and the darkness. The bridge was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. The rain had become the dominant sound, a steady, all-encompassing white noise that blurred the edges of everything. The river was barely audible now, lost beneath the million tiny impacts of drops on water. The thatch above your head dripped continuously, a slow, rhythmic beat that was so regular it was almost a metronome. Water ran in small streams along the stone parapets, following the channels worn by centuries of rain, and it pooled in the worn depression at the center of the bridge, before spilling over the sides and falling into the river below. You stood in your small shelter, your hands resting on the wet beam, your cloak heavy with moisture, and let the rain wash over your senses. The world had become small and close and soft, all sharp edges smoothed away by the falling water. There was a comfort in this, a sense of being enclosed and protected, as though the rain had built walls around the bridge and made a small private space where nothing was required of you except to stand and listen. The counting was done, the wagon was gone, and there was only the rain and the river and the ancient stone beneath your feet. The hours before dawn stretched on, measured not in minutes, but in the subtle shifts of the rain's intensity. Sometimes it fell harder, the drops drumming on the thatch with a faster, more urgent rhythm. Then it would ease again, becoming a soft, misty drizzle that seemed to float in the air rather than fall. Through all of it, you remained motionless, a part of the bridge, a part of the night, waiting patiently for whatever the next hour might bring. The oxen's deep, slow hoof-beats still echoed somewhere in your memory, a faint, fading rhythm that you could recall if you chose, but you did not choose. You simply let them fade, as all things faded, into the soft grey sound of the rain. The long, steady rain had stopped sometime in the deep hours before dawn, not with a final drop, but with a gradual thinning so slow that you did not notice the moment it ended. The sound of water on thatch simply faded, the rapid patter becoming a slow drip, then an occasional drip, then silence. The everyday heroes who, the smite tipped into with moisture that clung to every surface, and the world smelled of wet earth and wet stone and the clean, cold scent of the river. You stood at the toll gate, your cloak damp and heavy on your shoulders, your hands resting on the slick wooden beam, and you felt the air change as the first hint of dawn approached. It was not light, yet the sky was still the deep, featureless grey of late night, but the quality of the darkness had shifted, becoming softer, less absolute. From the surface of the river, mist began to rise. It started as thin tendrils, pale and almost invisible against the dark water, curling upward like the breath of some vast, sleeping creature. The tendrils thickened and merged, forming a low, white layer that spread across the river and crept up the stone piers and over the parapets. The mist was cool and wet against your face, a drifting vapor that softened the edges of everything. The far bank disappeared, then the middle of the bridge, then the stone parapet, just a few paces away. Soon you could see only the toll gate, the wooden beam under your hands, the canopy above your head, and the nearest stones at your feet. Everything else was a soft grey-white blankness that moved slowly in the still air. The mist muffled the world. The river, which had been a constant companion through the night, fell almost silent. You could still hear it, but the sound was distant and blurred, as though the water were flowing under a thick blanket. The drip of water from the thatch was a soft, irregular sound that seemed to come from no particular direction. The eretzer felt thick, pressing gently against your ears, and your own breathing sounded louder in the muffled quiet. The mist had a way of making the world small again, reducing it to the few feet of space around you, and you found yourself standing very still, breathing slowly, allowing the soft greyness to fill your senses. In this deep, muffled hour, sound travelled strangely. A noise that was far away could seem close, and a noise that was close could seem to come from everywhere at once. The mist blurred the line between distance and nearness, and you listened with a different kind of attention, an attention that did not try to locate or identify, but simply received whatever the mist chose to deliver. It was into this quiet, blurred world that the first thin sound of the flock arrived. You heard it first as a high, faint tremor, a quavering note that seemed to hang in the mist without a source. It was the bleat of a sheep, thin and distant, and it was joined a moment later by another bleat, and then another. The sounds were scattered and irregular, like the calls of birds waking in a fog, and they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then, beneath the bleating, you began to hear another sound, a soft, continuous whisper that was not the river and not the wind. It was a dry, rustling sound like thousands of small things brushing against each other, and beneath that was a delicate, rapid tapping, so faint and so fast that it was almost a single continuous hiss. The flock was approaching. You stood motionless in the mist, your hands light on the beam, and you listened as the sound grew slowly nearer. The bleating became more distinct, individual voices separating from the chorus, the low, insistent call of a ewe, the higher, thinner response of a lamb. The rustling sound was the movement of many bodies pressing together, wool rubbing against wool, and the tapping was the sound of dozens and dozens of small cloven hooves on the wet earth of the road. The combined sound was not loud, but it filled the mist completely, surrounding you on all sides, a soft, living noise that had no edges and no pauses. The shepherd emerged from the mist first. He was a tall, thin shape that grew slowly more solid as he approached the bridge, his body wrapped in a long patched cloak, his head covered by a wide-brimmed hat that dripped water from its edge. He carried a crook in one hand, a long, curved staff of polished wood, and he walked with the slow, patient stride of a man who had spent his life following animals across empty hills. Behind him, filling the road from side to side, came the flock. The sheep moved as a single, flowing mass, their bodies packed close together, their heads bobbing, their ears twitching. They were small, sturdy animals with thick, greasy wool that glistened with moisture in the faint grey light. Their eyes were pale and expressionless, and their mouths moved constantly as they chewed on nothing. The sound of their hooves was a soft, rapid pattering. Each sheep had 4 small hooves, 2 on each foot, and those hooves struck the packed earth with a light, sharp tap that was almost lost in the larger rustle of wool and breath. But there were so many of them that the individual taps merged into a continuous rippling sound, a susurrus that rose and fell as the flock moved. It was like the sound of a stream running over a bed of pebbles, water over stone, only drier and softer. You listened to that sound, feeling it wash over you in waves, and you prepared yourself for the count. The shepherd reached the edge of the bridge and paused. He peered into the mist toward the toll gate, and you could see his face now, weathered and brown, with deep lines around the eyes and a grey beard that was wet with mist. He did not speak, but he raised his crook in a brief, silent greeting. You raised your hand in return, a gesture that was almost lost in the grey air, and then he turned and spoke a low word to his flock. The sheep pressed forward, and the first animals stepped onto the stone of the crossing. The change in sound was immediate. The soft, dry pattering of earth became a sharper, clearer clatter as the tiny cloven hooves struck the wet stone. Each impact was a small, bright tick, so light and so quick that it was almost like the sound of rain, except it was irregular and alive. The first sheep placed its 4 hooves on the stone, tick-tick, then its hind hooves, tick-tick, 4 quick sounds that you caught and held. The second sheep followed immediately, its own 4 hooves adding another 4 ticks to the rhythm. Then the third sheep, the fourth, the fifth, and suddenly the individual sounds began to blur together, the ticks overlapping and merging into a constant, rippling clatter that was impossible to separate. You began your count, focusing your attention on the stream of animals as they flowed past the gate. Your method was to count each set of 4 hooves as a single unit, a silent tally of sheep rather than of individual hoof beats, because there were too many hooves to track separately. You watched the nearest animals, noting the bob of a head, the flash of a pale eye, the brief moment when all 4 hooves were on the stone before the sheep moved on. Each animal was a brief, distinct presence in the flowing mass, and you tried to hold on to that presence just long enough to register it before letting it go. 1 sheep, 2 sheep, 3 sheep, the numbers running softly through your mind, like a whispered litany. But the counting was difficult. The sheep pressed together as they crossed the bridge, their bodies so close that wool rubbed against wool and legs tangled. You could not always see where one animal ended and the next began. The flock moved as a single undulating mass, and the hooves were a constant, rippling sound that had no clear breaks. Sometimes 2 sheep would step onto the stone at almost the same moment, their hooves producing a flurry of 8 ticks that you had to sort through in your mind. Other times a sheep would pause halfway across, turning its head to bleat at a lamb that had fallen behind, and the pause would throw off your rhythm, creating a gap where you expected a beat. You kept counting, your attention fixed on the moving stream of animals. The mist made everything softer, blurring the edges of the sheep so that they seemed to emerge from a grey void, cross a brief patch of visible stone, and then dissolve back into the grey void on the other side. The shepherd stood somewhere in the mist, his crook resting on the parapet, his quiet voice occasionally rising in a low call to guide a stray animal back to the flock. The bleating continued, a constant, wavering chorus that echoed strangely in the mist, and the smell of the sheep, a thick, oily animal smell, warm and earthy, filled the air around you. You lost the count. It happened without warning. One moment you were moving smoothly from one number to the next, and the next moment your mind was empty, the thread of numbers broken, and you could not remember whether you had counted 43 or 44 or perhaps 45. The flock had not paused. The sheep continued their steady, rippling flow, their hooves clattering on the stone in that same soft, relentless rhythm. But the number was gone, lost somewhere in the mist. You stood still for a moment, letting the frustration of the lost count rise and then pass, like a ripple on the river. There was no point in holding on to it. The count was lost, and you would simply start again. You took a slow breath, drawing the cool, damp air deep into your lungs, and then you let it out just as slowly. The mist filled your mouth and nose, cool and tasteless. You settled your attention back onto the moving animals, picking a new starting point somewhere in the middle of the flock. A ewe with a dark patch on its ear stepped onto the stone, its small hooves striking 4 quick ticks, and you silently marked that animal as one. Another sheep followed, a lamb with spindly legs and a short, stubby tail, and you marked it as 2. The count resumed, the numbers flowing again through the quiet space of your mind. The flock continued to cross. The sound of the hooves had become so constant that it was almost a single sound, a soft, rushing clatter that was the background music of the mist. You no longer tried to hear the individual ticks. You simply used your eyes to mark each animal as it passed, trusting the visual cue of the full hooves on the stone more than the blurred sound. The sheep moved at a steady, unhurried pace, driven forward by the pressure of the animals behind them. They did not look at you. Their pale eyes were fixed on the path ahead, their small mouths still chewing, their ears twitching at the sounds of the lambs. The lamb bleats were high and thin, cutting through the deeper murmur of the ewes, and occasionally a ewe would answer with a low guttural call that rumbled through the mist. The mist itself began to change as the first hint of dawn approached. The soft grey was lightening very slightly, becoming a paler silver, and you could see a little further along the bridge now. The far parapet was visible as a dark line in the fog, and the shapes of the sheep were clearer, their outlines sharper against the pale mist. The river was still invisible, but you could hear it a little more distinctly, a low, gurgling presence beneath the clatter of the hooves. The thatch above your head dripped occasionally, a single drop falling onto the stone near your feet with a soft, hollow sound. You kept the count, moving from one number to the next with the same quiet, patient attention you had brought to every count that night. The numbers had a rhythm of their own, a slow, steady pulse that matched the flow of the flock. You did not think about the numbers as quantities. You simply experienced them as a sequence, a gentle, ongoing presence that filled your mind and pushed out all other thoughts. There was a peace in this, a deep, quiet peace that came from doing one simple thing and doing it for a long time without hurry or expectation. The flock, the mist, the bridge, the river, the slow lightening of the sky, all of it was part of a single, seamless moment that had no beginning and no end. After a time, you noticed that the stream of sheep was thinning. The tight-pressed mass of bodies had loosened, and individual animals were now separated by small gaps. You could see the stone of the bridge between them, wet and dark, and glistening faintly in the growing light. The sound of the hooves changed as the gaps widened. The continuous rippling clatter became a more distinct series of individual ticks, each set of 4 hooves audible on its own before the next set began. You could count them more easily now, each sheep a separate clear unit, and the numbers in your mind settled into a steadier, more confident rhythm. The stragglers were crossing, the older ewes and the cautious lambs that had hung back at the rear of the flock. The last sheep stepped onto the stone. It was a small lamb, very young, its wool still tight and curly, its legs uncertain on the slick surface. It paused in the middle of the bridge and let out a high, thin bleat, and from somewhere in the mist ahead a ewe answered with a deep, reassuring call. The lamb bleated again, then hurried forward, its small hooves ticking rapidly on the stone. You counted its 4 hoofbeats, the last 4 of the flock, and then it was gone, swallowed by the mist on the far side of the bridge. The count was complete. You did not know the final number. The early part of the count was lost in the confusion of the packed flock, and the number you had reached after starting again was only a fragment of the whole. But it did not matter. The counting had served its purpose, not as a record, but as a way of paying attention, a way of being present for the passage of the flock. The exact number was not important, the attention itself was what mattered, the quiet, steady focus that had carried you through the grey hour. You let the numbers dissolve, not with regret, but with a calm acceptance, the way the mist was dissolving now in the slow light of dawn. The sound of the flock faded into the distance. The bleating grew fainter, the rustle of wool became a whisper, and the rapid pattering of hooves receded until it was indistinguishable from the trickle of water somewhere in the mist. The shepherd's voice was the last thing you heard, a low, rhythmic call that guided the sheep along the road and then was gone. The mist was thinning and the world was returning piece by piece. The far bank emerged as a dark shape, then the trees, then the hills beyond, all of them pale and grey in the early light. The river appeared, a broad expanse of moving silver that reflected the mist and the sky. The bridge was itself again, its stones wet and dark, its parapet solid and real. You stood at the toll gate, your hands on the beam, and felt the cool air move across your face. The mist had left a fine layer of moisture on everything, tiny droplets that beaded on the wood and the stone and the wool of your cloak. The ache in your body was still there, a steady, familiar presence, but it seemed lighter now, as though the hours of standing had worn it smooth. Your mind was quiet, empty of numbers, empty of thoughts, just a calm, clear space that received the world as it was. The flock had passed, the hour of mist was ending, and the dawn was spreading slowly across the valley, pale and gentle, and full of the promise of another day. The mist had lifted entirely by the time the eastern sky began to glow with the first pale light of dawn. You stood at the toll gate on the stone bridge, your hands resting on the wooden beam, and you watched the world slowly emerge from the grey half-light of early morning. The river, which had been a hidden presence beneath the fog, was now a broad sheet of moving silver that reflected the pale sky. The trees on the far bank were dark shapes against a horizon that was turning from grey to a soft, cool yellow. The air was still in colder, carrying the clean, rinsed smell that follows a long rain, and the stone of the bridge was wet and dark, its worn surface glistening faintly. The thatch above your head dripped occasionally, the last drops of the night's rain falling with a soft, hollow sound onto the stones at your feet. Your body had settled into the familiar ache of long-standing, a deep, dull sensation lived in your lower back and the soles of your feet. It was not pain exactly, It was more like a weight, a heaviness that reminded you of the hours you had spent motionless at the gate. You shifted slightly, easing the pressure from one hip to the other, and felt the wooden beam creak under your hands. The beam was still damp from the rain, its surface cool and slightly slick, and you could feel the raised grain of the old oak against your palms. The leather of the toll pouch hung motionless at your side, dark with moisture, and the clay jug of water on the stool under the canopy was beaded with condensation. The dawn light grew slowly, spreading across the valley in bands of pale gold and soft rose. The stars had faded one by one, the cold light dissolved in the growing brightness, and now only the brightest planet remained, a single point of white low in the east. The birds had begun to wake. A single blackbird called from somewhere in the trees on the far bank, a clear, liquid note that repeated 3 times and then fell silent. A moment later another bird answered from the near bank, and then others joined in, a scattered, sleepy chorus that rose and fell without urgency. The river's murmur seemed louder now that the muffling mist was gone, its steady, patient voice filling the air beneath the birdsong. You listened to all of it without focusing, letting the sounds blend together into the quiet music of early morning. Then, from the far side of the river, you heard a sound that broke through the gentle chorus. It was a deep, heavy sound, a slow, rhythmic thud that you felt as much as heard. The sound was still distant, but it carried clearly through the still morning air. A low, percussive beat that seemed to roll along the ground like distant thunder. Your ears, sharpened by the long night, identified the source immediately. A heavy horse walking, and behind it the rumble of a loaded cart. The combination of sounds was unmistakable. The deep, slow thud of large hooves, the creak of a wooden axle, and the grinding rumble of iron-bound wheels on packed earth. This was not the light crick-tap of a mule or the soft patter of sheep. This was a sound of weight and substance, a sound that spoke of grain sacks and millstones and the slow, steady labor of the countryside. You straightened slightly, your hands shifting on the beam, and turned your attention to the road on the far bank. The light was still dim, but you could see the road clearly now, a pale strip that wound away between the dark hedgerows. For a long moment you saw nothing. The sound continued to approach, the thud and creak and rumble growing slowly louder, but the road remained empty. Then, as you watched, a shape appeared around a distant bend. It was tall and broad, a great dark mass that moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The miller's cart. The horse came first, a massive Shire horse with a coat the colour of dark ale and feathered hair around its enormous hooves. The animal walked with a ponderous, steady gait, its head low and its neck arched, its great shoulders rolling with each step. The muscles in its haunches bunched and released, a slow, powerful motion that drove the animal forward. Its mane was long and thick, hanging down over its neck in pale strands, and its tail swished slowly from side to side. Behind the horse, the cart loomed, a heavy wooden frame with high sides, loaded with sacks of flour or grain that were piled neatly and covered with oiled canvas. The cart had 2 large wheels, their wooden spokes thick and sturdy, their iron rims caked with mud from the road. On the driver's seat sat the miller, a broad-shouldered man in a flour-dusted tunic, his sleeves rolled up despite the cold, his hands holding the reins with the easy confidence of long practice. The sound of the horse's hooves on the earth was a deep, solid thud, each impact a low, resonant boom that seemed to shake the air. The horse was shod with heavy iron shoes, and those shoes struck the packed dirt with a weight that made the ground tremble. You could feel the vibration through the soles of your boots, a faint rhythmic pulse that travelled up through the stone of the bridge and into your bones. The iron shoes had a different quality from the bare hooves you'd heard earlier in the night. They were harder, sharper, even on the soft earth, producing a sound that was more metallic, more ringing, a deep clang that was muffled by the dirt but still audible beneath the thud. The rhythm was slow, perhaps 2 seconds between each step, a pace that spoke of great weight and careful movement. The cart added its own music. The axle, worn smooth by years of use, creaked with a high, thin sound that repeated with every turn of the wheels, a long, singing creak that rose in pitch as the wheel turned, then fell silent, then rose again. The wheels themselves rumbled continuously, a low grinding sound that varied as they passed over stones or through ruts. The canvas cover flapped softly, and the sacks of grain shifted with a gentle sliding sound, the weight settling and resettling with each jolt. The miller's voice was a quiet murmur, a steady stream of low words spoken to the horse, not commands, but companionship, a sound that was almost part of the cart's creaking and the hooves' rhythm. You watched the cart approach, your attention fixed on the horse's hooves. The animal's iron shoes glinted faintly in the pale dawn light, sparks of dull silver that appeared and disappeared with each step. The horse's breath came in great billowing clouds of steam, each exhale a deep, rushing sound that matched the pace of the walk. The miller, seeing the bridge and the toll gate ahead, slowed the horse slightly, drawing back on the reins with a gentle pressure. The horse responded immediately, its pace easing, the rhythm of the hooves becoming even slower, even more deliberate. The miller raised a hand in greeting, a simple, casual gesture, and you raised yours in return. No words were needed, the routine was familiar to both of you. The horse reached the edge of the bridge and paused for a moment, its great hooves resting on the last stretch of earth before the stone. The miller spoke a quiet word, and the horse stepped forward, placing its right forehoof on the first stone of the crossing. The sound that followed was the most magnificent you had heard all night. The iron shoe struck the wet stone with a deep, resonant clang that rang out like a bell, a pure metallic note that seemed to fill the entire valley. The vibration traveled through the bridge in an instant, and you felt it in the wooden beam under your hands, a sharp, powerful tremor that hummed through the oak and into your fingers. The echo followed immediately, a clear ringing after sound that bounced off the stone parapets and rolled out over the river, fading slowly downstream. The second hoof struck, another iron-clad hoof landing on the stone with the same deep ringing clang. The note was slightly different, a little higher or a little lower, depending on the exact spot where the shoe hit the stone, but it was the same essential sound, a sound of immense weight and solidity. The third hoof followed, then the fourth, and you began your count without thinking. 1. The first great clang, the sound still hanging in the air. 2. The second, its echo overlapping with the first. 3. A slightly sharper note as the hoof struck a rougher patch of stone. 4. A deeper sound as the hind hoof landed near the center of the bridge. The count continued as the horse walked slowly across the crossing. The animal's iron shoes rang out with each step, 8 distinct clangs in total, each one a magnificent resonant note that seemed to make the bridge itself sing. The vibration under your hands was constant now, a low, rhythmic hum that matched the pace of the walk. You could feel the weight of the horse and cart through that vibration, a deep, slow sway that made the entire bridge tremble. It was not a shaking or a quaking. It was a gentle, almost soothing oscillation, like the slow roll of a boat on calm water. The ancient stones, set in place centuries ago, absorbed the weight and transmitted it through the arch, and the bridge held firm, as it had always held firm, as it would hold firm for centuries to come. The miller's cart followed the horse onto the bridge, its iron-bound wheels leaving the soft earth and rolling onto the stone with a sharp, rattling clatter. The sound of the wheels on the stone was harsh and irregular, a constant grinding and banging as the iron rim struck the uneven surface. The wooden spokes creaked, the axle sang its high, thin note, and the sacks of grain shifted with a soft, sliding sigh. The miller sat motionless on his seat, his body swaying with the movement of the cart, his hands light on the reins. He did not look at you. His attention was on the horse and the road ahead, his expression calm and patient. The flour dust on his tunic was pale in the dawn light, and his hair, which had once been dark, was now grey with the same fine dust. The horse's hooves continued their slow, ringing rhythm. You counted them carefully, holding each number in your mind before releasing it to make room for the next. 5. A deep, sonorous clang that seemed to come from the very heart of the bridge. 6. A slightly brighter note as the iron shoe struck a stone that was less warm. 7. The sound echoing off the water and returning as a faint, ghostly ring. 8. The final hoofbeat, a long resonant clang that hung in the air for a full second before beginning to fade. The count was complete, and you let the number go, watching as the last hind hoof left the stone and stepped onto the earth of the near bank. The cart followed, its wheels rolling off the stone with a final grinding crunch that softened immediately as they sank into the mud of the road. The sound of the iron shoes changed from the bright ringing clang of stone to the deep muffled thud of earth, and the horse, relieved of the caution required by the slick stones, picked up its pace just slightly, its great body swaying as it moved away from the bridge. The miller raised his hand again in a brief farewell, and you raised yours, watching as the cart continued along the road toward the village. The sound of the hooves and the wheels and the creaking axle faded slowly, the deep thud growing softer and softer, until it was indistinguishable from the murmur of the river and the distant chorus of the birds. The bridge was quiet again. The sun had risen fully now, a pale disk of gold that hung just above the eastern hills, and its light spread across the valley in long slanted beams. The river sparkled in the light, its surface a moving pattern of gold and silver and deep blue, and the wet stones of the bridge gleamed as though they had been polished. The air was warming slowly, the chill of the night beginning to retreat, and a light breeze stirred the leaves of the trees on the far bank. The birds were fully awake now, their song filling the morning with a cheerful, scattered music. The world was waking up, and the long night of counting hooves was over. You stood at the toll gate, your hands still resting on the beam, and felt the warmth of the sun touch your face for the first time in many hours. It was a gentle warmth, still weak with the early hour, but it was enough to make you close your eyes for a moment and let the light soak into your skin. The ache in your body was still there, but it seemed softer now, less insistent, as though the sunlight had eased it. You breathed in slowly, filling your lungs with the cool, clean air, and then let the breath out just as slowly. The smell of the river was fresh and cold, and underneath it was the faint, lingering scent of the Shire horse, warm hide, and the iron tang of its shoes. The memory of the great horse's hoofbeats still echoed somewhere in your mind, the deep ringing clang of iron on stone, the slow, powerful rhythm of the animal's walk. You could recall the sound if you chose to, could bring back the vibration that had hummed through the beam and into your hands. But you did not choose to. You let the memory sit where it was, a quiet impression that would fade in its own time. The count was done, the cart was gone, and the day had begun. You had stood through the night, through the darkness and the rain and the mist, and you had counted every hoof that crossed the ancient stones. That was enough. That was always enough. The morning had grown late by the time the stonecutter appeared on the road, and the sun had climbed well above the hills to pour a warm, golden light over the river valley. You stood at the toll gate on the stone bridge, your hands resting lightly on the wooden beam, and the heat of the day had begun to seep into the ancient stones under your feet. The wood was dry now, the grain warm against your palms where the sun touched it, and the thatch above your head smelled of dried reeds and dust. The river murmured its endless patient song, and the birds that had greeted the dawn were quieter now, their chorus settling into the occasional chirp or trill from the trees. The air was still and mild, carrying the scent of wet earth drying, the green smell of the river, and the faint sweetness of meadow grasses from the far bank. The long night of rain and mist and darkness was a memory now, softened by the brightness of the day. You had remained at your post through the early morning hours, counting the hooves of a farmer's pony and a pair of goats that had crossed just after sunrise. The counting had been easy, the numbers flowing through your mind with the familiar rhythm, and then the bridge had fallen quiet. The morning had stretched on in a slow, warm stillness, the kind of stillness that makes minutes feel like hours and hours feel like a single, unbroken moment. You did not mind the quiet. The quiet was part of the work, and the work was simply to be here, standing at the gate, waiting for the next set of 4 legs to carry their hooves across the stone. A figure appeared on the road from the village, walking alone. At first it was just a small shape in the distance, a dark vertical line against the pale dust of the road, but it grew slowly larger and more distinct, resolving into a man on foot. He walked with a steady, unhurried stride, his body leaning slightly forward under the weight of a leather bag slung across his shoulder. The bag was large and looked heavy, its strap cutting across his chest, and from within it came the faint musical chink of metal tools shifting against each other with each step. He wore a simple tunic of undyed wool, patched at the elbows, and sturdy boots that were scuffed and worn pale at the toes. His hands were large and rough, the hands of a man who worked with stone, and his face was brown and lined from years of squinting into the sun. He was a stonecutter, you knew, probably from the quarry upriver, walking to a job in one of the villages beyond the bridge. You watched him approach with the same quiet attention you gave to every traveller, but there was a difference now, that you felt even before you fully recognized it. This traveller had no animal. He was alone, his own 2 feet carrying him along the road, and there would be no hooves to count. The realization settled into your mind slowly, like a stone sinking through still water. For a moment your thoughts seemed to reach for a rhythm that was not there, the familiar automatic part of you searching for the 4-beat pattern even though your eyes told you there was none to find. The sensation was faint and brief, a tiny flicker of expectation that had nowhere to go, and then it faded, leaving a different kind of stillness in its place. The stonecutter reached the edge of the bridge and paused, shifting the weight of his bag on his shoulder. He looked up at you with a brief, easy nod, his eyes calm and unsurprised, as though he had seen a toll-keeper on this bridge 100 times and would see one 100 times more. You returned the nod, a small, wordless exchange that said everything that needed to be said. Then he stepped forward onto the first stone of the crossing, and the sound of his boots began. It was a soft sound, a scuffing, shuffling sound that had none of the clarity or the rhythm you were used to. His left boot landed with a dull scrape, the leather sole dragging slightly on the rough stone before settling its weight. His right boot followed, lighter and quicker, a short, soft thud that was almost a tap. Then the left again, but this time it landed cleanly without the scrape, a quiet, solid footfall that seemed to absorb into the stone rather than ring out. The rhythm was irregular, a human rhythm full of tiny variations, a longer pause here as he adjusted the bag, a shorter step there as he avoided a loose chip of stone, a slight stumble that made his heel come down harder for a single step before the rhythm smoothed out again. There was no pattern to lock onto, no steady beat that repeated itself in groups of 4. The sound was simply the sound of a man walking, and it did not ask to be counted. You listened anyway, not with the counting part of your mind, but with the part that simply heard. The boots were old and well worn, their soles soft with age, and they made a gentle brushing sound against the stone that was almost pleasant. Each footfall was a small, self-contained event, a brief pressure of leather on rock that lasted only a moment and then was gone, leaving no echo and no vibration. You could not feel his steps through the bridge the way you could feel the hooves of a horse. His weight was too small, his impact too soft, absorbed by the leather and the flesh and the easy, rolling gait of a man who had walked many miles. The bridge did not sing for him, and the river did not carry his footsteps downstream. He walked in a pocket of near silence, accompanied only by the chink of his tools and the soft huff of his breathing. As the stonecutter passed the midpoint of the bridge, you found your attention wandering away from him and settling instead on the bridge itself. Without the need to count, without the steady rhythm of hooves to anchor your thoughts, your eyes began to roam across the ancient stones. You had stood on this bridge for countless hours, days, years, and yet you realized that you rarely truly looked at it. You felt it under your feet and your hands. You heard it sing with the passage of hooves, but you seldom stopped to see it. Now, with no tally to keep, you let yourself look. The mortar between the stones was old and crumbling in places, a pale sandy grey that had been pressed into the cracks centuries ago by hands that were now dust. It was uneven, thicker in some spots where the stones did not quite fit together, thinner in others where the fit was so tight that the mortar was barely a thread. Tiny plants had taken root in the deeper cracks, small, determined things with fleshy green leaves and pale, star-shaped flowers that turned toward the sun. There were patches of lichen, too, spreading across the stone in circles of pale grey and muted orange, their edges soft and irregular, like stains left by water. The lichen grew where the stone was damp, in the shadows of the parapet and in the grooves where rainwater collected, and its surface was rough and dry, a tiny landscape of its own. You let your gaze travel along the length of the bridge, following the lines of the stones where they met the parapet. Each stone was different, you noticed. Some were dark grey, almost blue in the shadows, while others were a warm brownish grey with flecks of lighter minerals that sparkle faintly in the sun. Their surfaces were pitted and worn, the rough texture of the original cutting smoothed away in the center of the crossing by centuries of traffic. That worn area drew your eyes and held them. It was a shallow depression, no deeper than a finger's width, that ran along the center of the bridge from one end to the other. The stone there was polished to a dull sheen, darker than the surrounding rock, and it reflected the morning light as a soft, blurred gleam. Countless hooves had made that channel, pressing down on the stone year after year, decade after decade. Each hoof beat a tiny, imperceptible erosion that had added up over lifetimes to create this visible mark of time. You had felt the hooves that passed tonight, each one a distinct vibration, but you had never before considered the cumulative weight of all the hooves that had come before. The channel was a record of every horse, mule, ox, goat, and sheep that had ever crossed this river at this spot. A history written not in words, but in the slow wearing away of stone. The stonecutter's boots passed through that channel now, and you watched his feet land in the smoothed depression. His steps did not mark the stone. His soft leather soles were gentle, protective, leaving no trace. He walked as though he were walking across a floor he respected, his feet finding the worn path naturally, the way water finds the lowest ground. You saw him glance down once, briefly perhaps noticing the polished surface, perhaps not. A man who worked with stone for a living might see such things differently, might note the depth of the wear and calculate the centuries it had taken to form. Or he might simply walk on, his mind on his work, his thoughts full of chisels and mallets and the grain of the stone he would cut today. You did not know, and it did not matter. The bridge held its secrets quietly, asking nothing of anyone. The stonecutter reached the far end of the crossing, and the sound of his boots changed as he stepped off the stone and onto the packed earth of the road. The soft scuff became a duller, deader sound, the thud of leather on dirt, and his pace quickened slightly now that he was off the hard surface. He adjusted the bag on his shoulder again, the tools inside clinking together with a bright, musical sound, and then he continued along the road without looking back. You watched him go, a solitary figure growing smaller and smaller against the pale ribbon of the road, until he was just a speck that merged with the distant hedgerows and then disappeared. The sound of his footsteps faded more quickly, absorbed by the soft earth and the warm, still air, and soon there was nothing left of his passage but the memory of irregular scuffs and the faint, fading chime of metal. The bridge was quiet again, but it was a different quiet from the one that had come before. The absence of hooves felt more pronounced now, a space in your attention that had been briefly filled by the stonecutter's boots and was now empty. Your mind, so accustomed to the rhythm of counting, did not quite know what to do with this emptiness. It reached for a pattern and found none, and so it settled instead into a state of simple observation. You let your eyes wander again, and this time you noticed the river. It was flowing steadily beneath the arch, a broad greenish-blue current that swirled around the stone piers and continued downstream. The surface was dappled with sunlight, a shifting pattern of golden shadow that moved constantly without ever repeating. You could hear the water clearly now, its voice a low, continuous murmur that rose and fell very slightly as the current shifted. There were small whirlpools near the piers, tiny spirals of foam that spun in place for a moment and then dissolved, and further out the surface was smooth and glassy, reflecting the sky and the trees on the far bank. A kingfisher darted past, a flash of brilliant blue that streaked low over the water and vanished into the shadows under the bridge. You watched the spot where it had disappeared for a long moment, but it did not reappear. The warmth of the sun was pleasant on your face and hands, and you felt the long night's chill finally leaving your bones. Your cloak, still damp in places from the rain, was drying slowly, releasing the faint, clean smell of wet wool into the air around you. You shifted your weight slightly and heard the familiar creak of the wooden beam. The leather of the toll pouch was warm and soft, and the clay jug of water on the stool was now sun-warmed, its surface beaded with condensation. You were not thirsty, but you noted the jug's presence with a small, distant part of your mind. Everything was as it should be. The bridge was solid under your feet, the river was flowing, the sun was climbing toward noon, and you were here, standing at the gate, waiting. The waiting itself was a quiet kind of work. It required nothing from you but patience, and patience was something you had learned long ago. You had learned it on this bridge, during the long hours between travelers, during the deep silences of the night, when even the river seemed to hold its breath. Patience was not a straining, not an effort of will. It was a relaxation, a letting go of the need for anything to happen. It was the understanding that the next set of hooves would come when they came, and that the time between was not empty, but full of small peaceful things, the movement of water, the warmth of the sun, the slow drift of a cloud across the blue sky. You did not need to count the minutes, because the minutes did not matter. The bridge had been here for centuries, and it would be here for centuries more, and you were just one small part of its long, quiet history. A butterfly passed in front of your face, a small yellow one with wings that seemed too fragile to carry it. It fluttered erratically across the bridge, rising and falling on the light breeze, and then it veered away and disappeared over the parapet. You followed it with your eyes for a moment, and then your gaze returned to the road. The road was empty in both directions, a pale line that stretched away into the green of the countryside. The fields on either side were bright with summer growth, the crops rippling in the breeze like a green sea. You could hear the distant hum of bees, a low, steady drone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The world was drowsy and warm, and you felt your own eyelids grow heavy, your breathing slow and deepen. You did not sleep. A toll keeper does not sleep at the gate, but you allowed yourself to drift, your thoughts becoming soft and unfocused, like reflections in water that has been stirred. In that drifting state, your mind returned to the smooth depression in the center of the bridge. You pictured the hooves that had made it, the thousands upon thousands of animals that had crossed here before you were born. Draft horses and riding ponies, mules laden with goods, oxen pulling heavy carts, sheep and goats and the occasional donkey. You thought of the sound they must have made, the endless repeating rhythm of hoof on stone, a rhythm that had been playing for so long that it had worn a visible groove into the rock. You were part of that rhythm now, adding your own small moments of attention to the weight of years. The thought was not a grand one. It was quiet and simple, the kind of thought that arises when the mind is still and the world is warm and there is nothing to do but wait. The river whispered below, its voice soft and steady, and you listened to it with the same patient attention you brought to everything. The water was a constant, a presence that never changed, even as it never stopped changing. It was always moving, always flowing, always carrying itself away to the sea, and yet it was always here, passing under the same bridge, swirling around the same piers. You could hear in its murmur the memory of last night's rain, the water a little higher and a little faster than it had been the day before. You could hear the small splashes of fish rising to the surface, the subtle shifts of current as the river found its way around stones and fallen branches. The sound was a lullaby, ancient and endless, and it filled the quiet morning with a peace that was deeper than words. You waited. The sun moved slowly across the sky, its light shifting from pale gold to a warmer, deeper yellow. Your shadow, which had been long and thin when the stonecutter crossed, was now shorter and darker, a small pool of shade at your feet. The breeze died down, and the air grew still and warm, the kind of still that makes sounds travel far. You listened to the stillness, your ears searching automatically for the distant thud of hooves on the road. There was nothing yet, but you knew that something would come. Something always came. The bridge was a crossing, a place of passage, and the world was full of animals with hooves that needed to go from one side to the other. You would stand here and wait, and when the next set of four legs appeared on the road, you would lift your head and begin your count, and the rhythm would carry you forward into the afternoon. Until then there was the river, the sun, the ancient stone, and the quiet, patient presence of your own attention. The afternoon had grown warm and drowsy, the sun climbing to its highest point, and then beginning its slow descent toward the western hills. You stood at the toll gate on the stone bridge, your hands resting on the wooden beam that had grown almost hot under the direct light. And the world around you was quiet with the deep, slow quiet of midday. The river murmured below, a soft, constant hush that seemed to blend with the hum of insects in the meadows, and the air was thick with the scent of warm grass, dry stone, and the faint dusty smell of the road. Your cloak hung loose on your shoulders, barely needed now, and the ache in your feet had become a familiar, distant presence that you no longer noticed unless you thought about it. The long night of counting, the rain and mist, and the slow procession of animals felt very far away, as though it had happened in another life. You were simply here, standing at the gate, waiting for the next set of hooves to announce themselves on the road. They came not as a single set, but as a rolling, complex rhythm that reached your ears long before you could see the source. The sound began as a faint, rapid drumming, a light, quick thud-thud that was too fast for one horse and too irregular for a cart. As it grew slowly louder, it separated into layers, the higher, sharper tap of smaller hooves, the deeper thud of slightly larger ones, and between these sounds a soft, continuous rustle and the occasional creak of leather. Your mind, trained by the hours of listening, began to pass the rhythm even before you understood what it was. Multiple animals, walking in a line, their hooves not quite synchronized. The rhythm had a rolling quality, a cascade of beats that overlapped and separated and overlapped again, like the sound of a stream running over a series of small ledges. You straightened slightly, your ears sharpening, and turned your gaze to the road that led from the far countryside. They appeared around a distant bend, a small caravan of pack ponies tied nose to tail in a single file. The lead pony was a sturdy grey animal with a calm eye and a slow, steady walk, and behind it came four others, each tied by a short rope to the tail of the one in front. The ropes were just long enough to allow a little space between them, so that the ponies walked, not as a tight, uniform block, but as a spaced chain, each animal following the one ahead with a slight delay. On their backs they carried loads of undyed wool, great soft bundles wrapped in coarse cloth and bound with rope, the pale cream and grey of the fleece showing through the gaps in the covering. The loads were bulky but not terribly heavy, and the ponies moved with an easy, patient gait, their heads bobbing, their small ears flicking forward and back. Walking beside the lead pony was the merchant, a short, round man in a dusty travelling cloak and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. He held the lead rope loosely in one hand, and his other hand rested on a walking stick that he did not seem to need. His pace matched the pony's, a slow rolling walk that suggested he had been on the road for many days. The sound of the approaching train filled the warm air. The pony's hooves, unshod and small, struck the packed earth with a soft, light tapping that blended together into a continuous, rippling rhythm. There were 20 hooves in total, but on the earth they did not sound like individual beats. They sounded like a gentle, persistent patter the way rain sounds on a thatch roof, only drier and more rhythmic. The rustle of the wool bundles added a soft brushing undertone, and the creak of the rope and the leather harnesses provided a faint, irregular punctuation. The merchant's walking stick made a small, regular tap on the ground with every other step, a quiet counterpoint to the pony's rhythm. You listened to the whole complex of sounds, letting it wash over you, and you felt the familiar anticipation of a count beginning to form in the quiet space behind your attention. The merchant guided the lead pony to the edge of the bridge and then paused, turning his shaded face toward you. He gave a brief, friendly nod, and you could see the glint of his eyes under the brim of the hat. He raised a hand in greeting, and he spoke a quiet word to the lead pony, urging it forward. The pony stepped onto the first stone of the crossing, and the sound of the train changed instantly. The soft, dry patter of earth became a bright, sharp clatter as the first small hoof struck the stone. It was a lighter sound than any horse's hoof, a quick, clean tick that echoed briefly between the parapets and then was gone. The second hoof followed almost immediately, an equally light tick that was slightly higher in pitch because it struck a thinner stone, and then the third and the fourth hooves of the led pony completed its first stride on the bridge. You mark those 4 ticks in your mind with a silent, automatic awareness. That was 1 pony, 4 beats. But the counting had barely begun, because behind the lead pony came the second, its hooves already reaching the stone even as the lead pony's hind hooves were still ringing. The sound of the second pony's hooves overlapped with the first, creating a brief, complex flurry of 8 ticks that your mind had to separate. The lead rope between them, a short length of braided hemp, meant that the second pony was only a few feet behind the first, and its 4 hooves struck the stone almost at the same moment that the led pony's hind hooves were leaving it. The overlapping sounds were distinct if you listened carefully. The led pony's hooves were a little deeper, a little more solid, because that pony was slightly larger and carried the weight of the lead rope. The second pony's hooves were lighter and quicker, a shade higher in pitch. You let your attention settle on the stream of sound, not trying to separate each individual hoofbeat, but instead feeling the rhythm as a flowing sequence, a cascade of ticks that came in groups of 4 with small, natural pauses between them. The third pony reached the stone a fraction of a second after the second, and now there were 12 hooves in various stages of crossing. The bridge filled with sound, a bright, continuous clatter that seemed to dance in the warm air. The echoes were short and light, tiny ghost ticks that chased each other downstream, overlapping and fading. You could feel the vibrations through the wooden beam under your hands, but they were small, quick tremors, nothing like the deep, slow sway of the oxen or the resonant ring of the Shire horse. These ponies were light, each one no heavier than a man, and their passage was a delicate, rapid tapping that made the bridge hum at a higher, softer frequency. You began your count in earnest, letting the numbers form in your mind with the same calm, unhurried rhythm you had used all night. The lead pony's 4 hooves were the first group, and you marked them as one set, a single unit in the tally. Then came a brief pause, the tiny gap in sound that occurred as the lead pony moved forward, and the second pony's 4 hooves had not yet reached the exact spot where the lead pony's hind hooves had been. In that pause, the rope between them sagged slightly, and you could hear the faint creak of the hemp fibers as the tension eased. The second pony then stepped fully onto the stone, its own 4 hooves striking a quick, bright rhythm that you marked as the second set. Then another pause, slightly longer this time, because the third pony had lagged just a little, perhaps distracted by a fly, and the rope had tightened again with a soft, stretching sound. The third pony's hooves arrived, 4 more ticks, and you added them to the count. The rhythm was not perfectly regular. The ponies did not walk in perfect lockstep. Each had its own small variations in pace, its own slight hesitations and quickenings. The lead pony was the steadiest, its 4 beats coming with a reliable, even spacing that made the first set a model of consistency. The second pony, smaller and perhaps younger, took slightly quicker steps, its hooves striking the stone with a more rapid, almost nervous rhythm. The third pony was the slowest, its gait a little heavier, its hooves landing with a tiny fraction more weight. The fourth pony, tied behind the third, walked with an easy, lazy rhythm, as though it were half asleep, its hooves producing a soft, slightly dragging sound on the stone. The fifth pony, the last in the line, was the lightest of all, a small, neat animal with a quick, precise step that made its fall beats the sharpest and the cleanest of the entire train. You held all these variations in your mind, not as separate analyses, but as a single flowing awareness. The counting became a meditation, the numbers rising and falling like the river below, each set of 4 hooves a small wave that crested and then dissolved into the next. You did not rush the count. There was no need. The ponies were walking at a slow, steady pace, and the bridge was not long. The entire crossing would take only a minute or 2, but in that minute, the world outside the count began to fade. The merchant's slow footsteps, the tap of his walking stick, the rustle of the wool bales, all of it, receded from your attention, becoming a distant, unimportant background. The warm sun on your shoulders, the ache in your feet, the murmur of the river, even the sight of the ponies themselves, all of it dimmed. What remained was the sound, the pure, bright, rhythmic sound of 20 hooves striking ancient stone in an endless rolling cascade. You were no longer standing on a bridge in the warm afternoon. You were inside the count, floating in a world made entirely of numbers and rhythm. The led pony's hind hooves left the stone, and its contribution to the count was complete. 4 beats, noted and released. The second pony was now at the midpoint of the bridge, its hooves ringing out clearly in the center of the arch where the echo was longest. The tick-tick-tick of that pony's stride seemed to hang in the air a little longer, the sounds overlapping with each other as they bounced off the stone vault and returned. The third pony was just behind, its heavier steps providing a slight contrast, a deeper, more solid set of ticks that anchored the rhythm. The fourth pony's lazy, dragging steps created a soft, syncopated effect, a tiny hesitation in the flow, as though the count had taken a slow breath. The fifth pony, still near the far end, was a bright, rapid staccato that seemed to push the rhythm forward into the silence that waited beyond. You let the numbers come and go without holding on to them. 1 set, 2 sets, 3 sets, 4 sets, 5 sets. Each group of 4 was a complete thought, a small, perfect unit that required nothing more than to be acknowledged. The pauses between the sets were as much a part of the rhythm as the hooves themselves. In those pauses the rope sagged, the leather creaked, and the sound of the river briefly re-emerged before the next set of hooves covered it again. The pauses had their own texture, their own weight, and you listened to them with the same attention you gave to the ticks. The fifth pony reached the midpoint, and now the bridge was full of the sound of the train. The overlapping ticks from the rear of the line merged with the echoes of the forward ponies, creating a dense, shimmering texture of sound that was almost like music. There was no melody, only rhythm, but the rhythm was so rich and so layered that it seemed to contain its own harmony. The high ticks of the small pony, the deeper ticks of the third, the steady ticks of the lead, the dragging ticks of the fourth, all of them wove together into a tapestry of sound that filled your mind completely. You had no room for any other thought, and you did not want any other thought. The count was enough. The count was everything. The lead pony stepped off the far end of the bridge, and its hooves returned to the soft earth with a dull, muted tapping that faded quickly. The second pony followed a moment later, then the third, and the sound on the far side became a soft, irregular drumming that no longer echoed. The fourth pony's lazy hooves left the stone with a final dragging tick, and then only the fifth pony remained on the bridge, its quick, precise steps ringing out clearly in the sudden relative silence. You marked those last 4 beats with a special clarity, each tick a bright individual point of sound that stood alone. Then the fifth pony stepped onto the earth, and the count was over. The train continued along the road, the pony's hooves making that same soft, dry patter you had first heard approaching. The merchant's walking stick tapped a steady rhythm, and the wall bales rustled, and the ropes creaked, and slowly, slowly, the sound faded into the warm afternoon air. You watched them go, the small caravan growing smaller and smaller, until it was just a line of dark shapes against the pale road, and then it disappeared around a bend, and the world was quiet again. You stood at the toll gate, your hands on the wooden beam, and felt the silence settle around you like a soft blanket. The count was complete, 5 ponies, 20 hooves, 20 bright ticks on the ancient stone. The number did not matter, and you did not try to remember it. What mattered was the rhythm, the long rolling cascade of sound that had filled your mind and then released it. Your thoughts were quiet now, empty and calm, like a pool of still water after a stone has sunk to the bottom. The river murmured its endless song, the sun warmed your shoulders, and the bridge held you up as it had held up so many others before you. You waited, patient and still, for the next sound to come. The afternoon had grown warm and still, the kind of deep, golden stillness that comes in the long hours between midday and evening, when the sun seems to pause in its descent, and the whole world falls into a drowsy quiet. You stood at the toll gate on the stone bridge, your hands resting on the wooden beam that was now warm to the touch, its surface dry and smooth after the long morning of sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of hot stone, dry earth, and the faint sweetness of wild flowers from the meadow beyond the river. Even the river seemed to move more slowly now, its murmur a soft, lazy sound that barely disturbed the heavy silence. The water was low and clear, a pale greenish blue under the bright sky, and it reflected the sunlight in shimmering patches that danced on the underside of the bridge's arch. You had been standing for many hours, through the darkness and the rain and the mist, through the dawn and the morning and the slow climb of the sun to its zenith, and your body had grown heavy with a warm, spreading weariness that was not unpleasant. The ache in your feet and back had softened into a dull, distant throb, barely noticeable unless you shifted your weight, and your eyelids had begun to droop, the bright light making everything seem soft and hazy at the edges. You were not truly tired in the way of someone who has labored hard. You were tired in the way of someone who has been still for too long, in the warmth, lulled by the endless murmur of the water and the steady golden light. It was a sleepiness that crept up slowly, wrapping itself around your thoughts like a soft blanket. The light itself had a quality you rarely noticed at other times of day. It fell in broad, slanted beams through the gaps in the canopy's thatch, illuminating motes of dust that drifted lazily in the still air. The stone parapets glowed with a warm, honey-colored light, and the worn depression in the center of the crossing, polished smooth by centuries of hooves, shone like a ribbon of dark glass. The shadows under the arch were deep and cool, a dark blue-gray that made the bright river beyond seem even brighter. You could feel the heat radiating from the stone under your feet. A gentle warmth seeped through the soles of your boots and into your bones, and the wood of the beam under your hands had a living warmth to it, as though it had absorbed the sun and was now slowly releasing it back into the air. Under the arch of the bridge, swallows had built their nests. You could hear them even before you looked, a high, rapid twittering that echoed softly against the stone vault. The nests were small cups of mud and straw, plastered to the underside of the arch just below the highest point, and from them emerged the constant hungry chirping of nestlings. The parent birds darted in and out of the shadows, their forked tails and pointed wings cutting through the air with swift, precise movements. They would swoop low over the river, catching insects too small for you to see, and then arc back up into the darkness under the bridge, their flight a continuous flowing dance that seemed effortless. You watched them without focusing, your eyes following their patterns in a lazy, half-aware way, and their twittering blended with the murmur of the river and the distant hum of bees to form a soft, drowsy music. The bees were somewhere in the meadow on the far bank, a low, steady drone that rose and fell very slightly with the breeze. It was a sound of deep summer, a sound that spoke of clover and thyme and the heavy nodding heads of wild flowers bending under the weight of pollen. The drone was so constant that it seemed to become part of the silence, a background hum that your ears accepted and then forgot, the way they accepted the river's murmur. Occasionally a single bee would wander close to the bridge, its buzz growing louder for a moment before fading again, and you would blink slowly, your head turning just a fraction to follow the sound before settling back into stillness. The clouds above the valley were few and small, drifting in a sky that was a deep, washed-out blue, the color of old linen. They moved so slowly that you could not see their motion. You could only notice, after a long while, that a cloud which had been directly overhead was now nearer the hills, its shape slightly changed. Their reflections in the river were pale, soft shapes that drifted across the water's surface like wisps of cotton, distorting and reforming as the current tugged at them. You let your gaze rest on one of those reflections for a long time, your thoughts becoming as slow and formless as the clouds themselves, until you could not have said whether you were looking at the sky or the water. The day's traffic had slowed to almost nothing. The morning had brought a few travellers, a farmer with a cart of hay, a boy leading a cow to a new pasture, but the afternoon had emptied the roads. The sun was too hot for travel, and anyone with sense was resting in the shade, waiting for the cool of evening before continuing their journey. The road in both directions was a pale, empty ribbon that shimmered faintly in the heat, and the only movement anywhere was the slow drift of the clouds, the darting of the swallows, and the gentle ripple of the river. You were alone on the bridge, alone with the warmth and the quiet and the soft, insistent pull of sleep. Your head nodded once, a slow, involuntary dip that made you blink and straighten slightly. Your hands tightened on the beam, and you shifted your weight from one foot to the other, forcing your eyes to focus on the far bank. The world swam back into clarity, and you took a slow, deep breath, the warm air filling your lungs. You were not supposed to sleep at the gate. A toll-keeper must be awake to count the hooves and collect the coins. But the afternoon was so warm, and the bridge was so quiet, and the river's murmur was so steady that staying awake felt like trying to hold back the tide. You let your eyelids droop again, just a little, and your thoughts began to drift once more, floating on the warm golden sea of the afternoon. It was then that you heard the sound, thin and distant at first, barely a ripple in the deep quiet. It was not the heavy thud of a horse or the slow rumble of a cart. It was a lighter, quicker sound, a delicate, irregular tapping that seemed to skip across the surface of the silence. You lifted your head, your drowsiness receding just enough to sharpen your attention, and you listened. The sound grew slowly louder, and you recognized it. The clatter of small cloven hooves, lighter than a sheep's, with a quick skipping rhythm that was full of tiny pauses and sudden bursts. Goats. 2 of them, you thought, listening to the pattern. The hooves were not in perfect synchrony. One goat walked with a slightly faster pace, its hooves tapping out a light, skittering rhythm, while the other was slower and more deliberate, its steps a little heavier. The goather appeared on the road from the village, a young man in a rough tunic with a staff in his hand and a wide straw hat shading his face. He walked with an easy, loping stride, and beside him came the 2 goats, small, neat animals with short horns and coats of brown and white. They were not tied. They followed the herder out of habit, their heads bobbing, their ears flicking, their mouths chewing on nothing. The goats moved with a characteristic restlessness, veering to the side of the road to nibble at a tuft of grass, then skipping forward to catch up, their hooves producing a constant, playful clatter that was full of unexpected little rhythms. You watched them approach through half-closed eyes, your mind already reaching for the count. The goat's hooves on the packed earth made a soft, dry tapping, a sound that was higher and faster than the sheep's had been, with a sharper, more brittle quality. Each goat's 4 hooves struck the ground in a quick sequence that was hard to separate, the 4 hooves and hind hooves so close together that they almost merged into a single double tap. The sound was lively and irregular, full of sudden accelerations and pauses, and it seemed to dance in the warm air like the swallows under the bridge. The goatherd reached the edge of the crossing and paused, looking up at you with a brief, easy smile. You raised a hand in greeting, the movement slow and heavy, and he nodded, then clucked his tongue softly to urge the goats forward. The first goat, the brown one with the quicker pace, stepped onto the stone of the bridge, and the sound of its hooves changed instantly from a dry tap to a sharp, bright click. It was a tiny sound, so light and quick that it seemed more like the click of a fingernail on wood than a hoof on stone. The second goat followed a moment later, its hooves producing a slightly deeper, more solid click, and the two animals began their crossing. You let your eyes drift nearly closed, your head slightly bowed, and you listened to the rhythm. The first goat's hooves were a rapid, skittering pattern, click, 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 4 beats so fast that they were almost a single sound. The second goat's hooves were slower, a more deliberate click, click, click that fell just behind the first, creating a syncopated, overlapping rhythm that was oddly soothing. You began your count without fully waking, the numbers forming in the drowsy, half-lit space behind your eyes. 1 set of 4 for the brown goat, the clicks so light and quick that you almost missed one. A pause as the goat skipped forward, its hooves leaving the stone for a moment before landing again. Then the second goat's 4 clicks, slower and steadier, a gentle, reassuring counterpoint. Then the first goat again, already halfway across, its hooves still quick, but now slightly slower as it picked its way over the worn center of the bridge. The pattern repeated, a soft, skipping litany that seemed to pull you deeper into the warm golden haze. Your body swayed very slightly, a gentle, rhythmic movement that matched the pace of the goat's hooves. You were not fully aware of it. The swaying was automatic, your body responding to the rhythm the way a boat responds to waves. The wooden beam under your hands seemed to hum with a faint, sleepy vibration, and the warmth of the sun was a heavy, golden weight on your shoulders and the back of your neck. The world had become a soft, blurred dream of light and sound, and the count was no longer a conscious effort, but a gentle current that carried you along. You caught yourself leaning on the toll beam. Your weight had shifted forward, your chest pressing against the wood, your head drooping so that your chin nearly touched your chest. The sudden awareness of your own posture cut through the drowsiness like a stone dropping into still water, and you straightened with a small, quick intake of breath. Your hands tightened on the beam, and you shook your head slightly, the movement slow and heavy. The goats were still crossing. The brown one was near the far end, its hooves making the final few clicks on the stone, and the white one was just behind, its slow, steady rhythm unchanged. You had not lost the count, though the numbers had become faint and dreamlike, and you held on to them with a quiet effort as the last goat's hind hoof left the stone. The final click faded, and the count was complete. 2 goats, 8 hooves, 8 small sharp sounds on the ancient stone. You let the numbers go, and they dissolved like mist in the sun. The goather raised his staff in a casual farewell, and you lifted your hand in return, the gesture slow and heavy. Then they were gone, the sound of their hooves on the earth fading quickly into the hum of the bees and the murmur of the river. The bridge was empty again, and the quiet returned, deeper than before. You stood at the gate, your eyes still heavy, and you listened to the water and the bees and the distant, contented chirping of the swallows under the arch. The warmth of the afternoon wrapped around you like a blanket, and you let yourself lean slightly against the beam, not sleeping, but not fully awake, drifting in a quiet golden space between the two. The day's traffic had passed, and the evening was still hours away. There was nothing to do but stand here, feeling the sun on your skin, hearing the slow, steady song of the river, and waiting for the next sound to come out of the warm, drowsy silence. The world was peaceful, and you were at the center of that peace, a quiet, motionless figure on the old stone bridge, counting the slow beat of your own heart in the stillness. The sun had set for the second time since you had taken your place at the toll gate, and the long dusk had faded into a clear, cold night. You stood on the stone bridge, your hands resting on the wooden beam, and above you the sky was a vast, dark field, filled from horizon to horizon with stars. The earlier clouds had vanished with the last light, leaving the heavens bare and shimmering, each constellation sharp and bright as though it had been newly polished. The river below caught the starlight and held it, so that the water seemed to flow not with its own darkness, but with a scattered, shifting carpet of cold white points. Looking down from the parapet, you could not tell where the river ended and the sky began. Both were the same deep black. Both were filled with the same trembling lights, and the bridge itself seemed to float between two infinities of stars. The air was cold in a way it had not been during the previous night. A sharp, dry cold that made the stone feel brittle under your boots and drew the warmth from your hands. Your breath emerged in small steady clouds that drifted away over the river and dissolved. The wood of the beam was cool and smooth, its daytime warmth long gone, and the grain of the old oak was crisp against your palms. You had pulled your cloak tight around your shoulders, and the wool, still carrying the faint memory of rain, enclosed you in a small pocket of warmth. The silence was deeper than it had been at any other hour, not the muffled silence of mist or the soft silence of rain, but a clear, ringing silence in which every small sound seemed to travel forever. You could hear the tiny lap of water against the nearest pier, the faint creak of the beam as you shifted, the distant call of an owl somewhere far up the valley. Each sound was separate and distinct, a brief presence in the great quiet. You had been standing here through the turn of the day, through the golden drowsiness of afternoon and the slow, colourful fade of evening. The last of the swallows had disappeared into their mud nests under the arch, and the bees had fallen silent with the coming of dark. The world had emptied of its daytime voices, and now only the night sounds remained. The river, the stars, the cold air, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. The weariness that had pulled at your eyelids in the warm hours had passed, replaced by a quiet, wakeful stillness that was not alertness, but a deep, calm presence. You were not waiting for anything in particular. You were simply here, part of the bridge and the night, as you had been so many times before. It was into this crystal silence that the final traveller of the night announced himself. The sound came from the far side of the river, from the road that led away into the dark countryside, and it was so faint at first that it might have been a memory of a sound, an echo of all the hooves you had counted before. But it grew steadily, resolving into the familiar, even rhythm of a walking horse, a soft thud on packed earth, 4 beats repeated in an unhurried cycle. The sound was lighter than the shire horse's deep resonance, quicker than the oxen's slow plod, more regular than the mule's careful steps. It was a riding horse, you knew, a quiet animal walking without urgency, carrying a rider who was in no hurry to reach their destination. The rhythm reached you across the cold air, clear and small, like a distant drum. You did not move, but your attention sharpened slightly, settling onto the approaching sound with the ease of long practice. The hoofbeats grew louder by slow degrees, and soon you could hear the individual strikes, the heavier forehoof, the lighter hind hoof, the tiny pause between the diagonal pairs. The horse's iron shoes produced a faint metallic ring even on the earth, a hint of the sharper sound that would come when it reached the stone. There was no lantern this time. The rider travelled by starlight alone, trusting the horse to find the way, and so you saw nothing until the shapes emerged from the darkness at the edge of the bridge. The horse was dark, a deep bay or a black, its coat holding the starlight in a faint, soft gleam along its neck and shoulders. It walked with its head low, its ears relaxed, its breath steaming in the cold air. On its back sat a rider wrapped in a heavy cloak, the hood pulled forward so that the face was entirely hidden. The rider held the reins loosely in one gloved hand, and the other hand rested quietly on the pommel of the saddle. There was no pack, no cargo, no cart trailing behind, just a person and a horse, crossing the river in the deep hours of the night, their only companions, the stars and the water and the ancient stones. The horse reached the edge of the bridge and paused for a moment, not from uncertainty, but from a kind of courtesy, a pause that allowed the rider to acknowledge the toll gate. The hooded head turned slightly toward you, and a gloved hand lifted in a small, silent greeting. You raised your own hand in return, the gesture slow and calm, and then the rider spoke a quiet word to the horse. The animal stepped forward, placing its right forehoof on the first stone of the crossing. The sound that followed was the sound you had been hearing all your life, the sound that the bridge was built for, the sound that had worn the smooth channel into the center of the stone. The iron shoe struck the rock with a clean, bright clop, a note that rang out once and then echoed softly between the parapets before drifting downstream. The second hoof followed, producing an almost identical clop, and then the third and the fourth, the familiar four-beat pattern that you had counted so many times it had become part of your own heartbeat. You began your count without thought, the numbers rising silently in the quiet of your mind. 1. A clear, ringing note as the forehoof landed on a worn stone near the edge, the sound sharp and precise. 2. The opposite hind hoof, a little lighter, a little higher in pitch, the echo overlapping briefly with the first before fading. 3. The other forehoof striking a stone that was slightly rougher, the sound a shade brighter, a small variation in the steady rhythm. 4. The final hind hoof, a deep, solid clop that seemed to anchor the sequence, the vibration traveling through the bridge and into the wooden beam under your hands. The horse walked slowly, its pace unhurried, and the rhythm repeated itself with a calm, steady certainty. You felt each hoofbeat through the beam as a tiny, gentle tremor, a brief pressure that came and went in perfect time. The vibrations were lighter than the Shire horse's deep sway, softer than the oxen's rolling weight, but they were unmistakable. The song of the bridge, the voice that spoke only when Hooves crossed the stone. You let the count continue, holding each number for just a moment before releasing it, the sequence flowing through you like the river flowed under the arch. The horse and rider moved across the bridge in the starlight, their shapes dark against the star-filled sky. The horse's legs rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm, the iron shoes glinting faintly with each step. The rider sat motionless, swaying gently with the horse's walk, the hooded head bowed as though in thought or in sleep. There was no sound from the rider, no voice, no creak of leather beyond the soft, rhythmic flex of the saddle. The horse's breath came in deep, steady gusts, each exhale a puff of white that glowed briefly in the starlight before dissolving. The river murmured below, its voice a constant, gentle presence beneath the hoofbeats, and the stars above watched in silence. The horse reached the center of the bridge. Here, in the worn depression polished smooth by centuries of passage, the sound of the hooves changed very slightly, becoming a little softer, a little rounder, as the rough stone gave way to the smooth, dark channel. The rhythm did not falter. The horse's iron shoes found the familiar groove and followed it, the way water follows a stream bed. You noted the change without breaking the count, your mind accepting the softer note as it had accepted the sharper one, each variation a small familiar detail in a pattern you knew by heart. The count continued. 5. A soft clop in the center of the arch, the echo longer and more drawn out as it rolled down the river. 6. The hind hoof following, a lighter note that seemed to hang in the air a fraction longer than usual. 7. The other 4 hoofs stepping out of the smooth channel and onto a rougher patch, the sound sharpening again. 8. The final hoof, a bright, clear note that rang out once and then began to fade. The horse had crossed the center, and now the sounds were moving away from you, growing slightly fainter as the animal approached the far end of the bridge. The rider did not look back. The hooded head remained bowed, the gloved hands still, the body swaying with the same gentle, unconscious rhythm. The horse's pace did not change. It walked on, its ears relaxed, its tail swishing slowly from side to side. The final hoofbeats fell on the stones near the far bank, each one a little softer than the last, the echoes becoming shorter and closer together as the sound had less distance to travel. You marked each beat as it came, a quiet, patient tally, until the last hind hoof left the stone and stepped onto the packed earth of the far road. The sound changed instantly from the bright, ringing clop of stone to the soft, muffled thud of earth. The horse took a few more steps, the rhythm continuing unchanged, and then the sound began to fade as the rider continued along the road. You let the final number settle in your mind and then released it, the count complete. The last hoofbeat of the night had been counted, and the tally was done. The sound of the horse's walking grew fainter and fainter, the thud of hooves on earth becoming a soft, distant pulse that blended with the murmur of the river and then dissolved into it. You stood at the toll gate, listening, until the night was once again filled only with the water and the stars and the deep crystal silence. The traveler was gone, and the road was empty, and the world had returned to its quiet, patient waiting. You did not move. Your hands rested on the wooden beam, your weight balanced on the ancient stones, and you let the stillness settle around you like a familiar cloak. The cold air touched your face, and the river murmured its endless song, and the stars above the bridge shone down with a light that had traveled for unimaginable years to reach this small, quiet place. You felt the bridge beneath you, solid and enduring, its stones set in place by hands long forgotten, its arch holding the weight of centuries. The smooth depression in the center, polished by countless hooves, was invisible in the darkness, but you knew it was there, and you knew that tomorrow more hooves would cross it, and the day after that. The thought brought a quiet comfort, a sense of continuity that needed no words. You were a small part of something very old, a single thread in a tapestry woven from stone and water and the endless passage of animals across the river. Tomorrow you would stand here again, your hands on this same beam, and you would hear the first hoofbeats of the morning, and you would count them, one by one, just as you have tonight, and just as someone else would do long after you were gone. The bridge would remain, and the river would flow, and the hooves would strike the stone in their patient, repeating rhythm. Nothing ended. Everything simply continued, a slow, quiet cycle that turned with the earth and the stars. You lifted your eyes to the sky. The constellations had wheeled further since the last time you looked, their bright patterns shifting slowly toward the west. The brightest star, the one that always appeared first after sunset, was now low on the horizon, a cold, steady point of light that seemed to rest on the dark line of the hills. The river reflected it as a single trembling spark, a tiny twin of the star above, and you watched it for a long moment, your thoughts slow and calm. The night was deep, and the world was asleep, and you were the only waking soul on the bridge, keeping a quiet vigil over the water and the stone. The ache in your body had become so familiar that it was no longer an ache, but simply a part of you, a steady, companionable presence that reminded you of the hours you had spent standing here. Your feet were cold and your fingers were stiff on the beam, but these sensations were distant, unimportant, like sounds heard from far away. What mattered was the stillness, the deep, peaceful stillness that filled the bridge and the river and the sky. It was,